Hey there, history lovers. Tonight we're stepping into the real medieval world. Not the one with shiny knights and fancy castles you see in movies, but the one where actual people woke up every morning and went to work. And let me tell you, their jobs were way more interesting than your average office cubicle. We're talking about the bakers who could get punished for selling underweight bread, the barbers who moonlighted as surgeons, and the executioners who earned good money but couldn't grab a beer at the local tavern without everyone suddenly remembering they had somewhere else to be. Before we jump in, do me a favour, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I love seeing how far these videos travel while people are winding down for the night. Alright, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's take a walk through the medieval marketplace. We're about to meet the real workers who built this world. One horseshoe, one loaf of bread, and one suspicious-looking potion at a time. Ready? Let's go. So here's the thing about medieval society that most history books gloss over in favour of talking about knights and castles. The vast majority of people never got anywhere near a sword or a throne. Instead, they woke up every morning, probably before the sun did, and went to work. Real work. The kind that left your hands calloused and your back aching, and your clothes covered in whatever substance your particular profession involved. And trust me, depending on your job, that could be anything from flour dust to animal blood to stone powder, that slowly destroyed your lungs over the course of decades. We love to simplify medieval society into those three neat categories: the ones who pray, the ones who fight, and the ones who work. It makes for a tidy little pyramid in textbooks, and a convenient way to organise your thoughts about the Middle Ages. The clergy handled your spiritual needs, the nobility protected you from invaders and occasionally from each other, and everyone else did literally everything else required to keep civilization running. Except that third category wasn't some monolithic block of identical peasants all doing the same back-breaking labour in muddy fields. Not even close. The reality was far more complex and infinitely more interesting. Medieval society was actually this intricate mosaic of specialised professions, each one fitting into a massive economic puzzle that somehow kept entire kingdoms functioning. You had people who spent their entire lives perfecting one specific craft, passing down knowledge through generations, forming guilds that wielded serious political power and creating products that range from essential to luxury. These weren't just generic workers. These were skilled professionals with expertise in their fields, people who understood their trades with a depth that would put many modern workers to shame. Think about it this way. Every loaf of bread someone ate required a whole chain of specialised workers. You needed farmers to grow the grain, sure, but then you needed millers to grind it, bakers to turn it into bread, and probably someone to transport the grain between all these different stages. Every piece of cloth someone wore meant shepherds tending flocks, workers cleaning and preparing wool, spinners creating thread, weavers making fabric, fullers treating it, and dyers colouring it. A single iron nail in someone's door represented miners extracting ore, smelters processing it, and blacksmiths forging it into usable form. Multiply this across every single product and service a medieval person needed, and you start to get a picture of just how many different occupations existed. From dawn to dusk, medieval towns and villages hummed with activity. Well, maybe hummed is too gentle a word. More like clanged and shouted and creaked, and generally made the kind of racket that would have modern noise ordnance officers having nervous breakdowns. Blacksmiths hammered metal, creating sparks and smoke and that distinctive ringing sound that carried for blocks. Butchers called out their wares while dealing with the less pleasant aspects of their trade. Carpenters sawed wood, creating mountains of sawdust and occasionally fingers. Workplace safety wasn't exactly a medieval priority. Fishmongers competed to sell their increasingly less fresh inventory as the day wore on, a competition that probably involved a lot of creative descriptions about when exactly those fish were caught. These ordinary professions formed the foundation of medieval civilization. They weren't glamorous. Nobody wrote epic poems about the guy who spent his days making barrels, or the woman who brewed ale in her kitchen. But without these people doing their jobs day in and day out, medieval society would have collapsed faster than you could say, bubonic plague. Cities needed to be fed, clothed, housed, and supplied with everything from horseshoes to church bells. None of that happened by magic, despite what some medieval people might have suspected about certain professions. What's particularly fascinating is how specialised things got. You didn't just have one person who worked with leather, you had different craftspeople for shoes, belts, saddles, book bindings, and armour. You didn't have generic cloth makers. You had wool workers, linen weavers, silk workers, and people who specialised in specific types of fabric that you've probably never heard of and definitely can't pronounce. Some cities had workers who did nothing but make one specific part of one specific product. Talk about job security, assuming demand for that incredibly specific item didn't suddenly dry up. The working day for most medieval professionals started brutally early. We're talking pre-dawn, when normal people would still be deep in REM sleep and dreaming about literally anything other than their upcoming workday. Bakers had to start their fires and prepare dough hours before anyone else woke up, because people expected fresh bread in the morning and weren't particularly understanding about delays. Shepherds needed to get their flocks out to pasture at first light. Market vendors had to set up their stalls and prepare their goods before customers arrived. By the time the sun actually rose, a significant portion of the medieval workforce had already been working for hours. No hitting the snooze button in the Middle Ages, and the workday didn't end when modern 9-to-5 workers would be heading home. Medieval professionals worked until the job was done or until darkness made continuing impossible, whichever came first. In winter, that meant shorter workdays, which sounds great until you realise it also meant less income and you still had the same expenses. In summer, you might be working 16-hour days, which is exactly as exhausting as it sounds. The concept of weekends didn't really exist in the modern sense, though there were plenty of religious holidays when work was prohibited. The Catholic Church inadvertently gave medieval workers more days off than many modern employers, which tells you something about progress. The tools and technology these workers used would seem impossibly primitive by modern standards. Everything was manual labour. When a miller needed to move a sack of grain, he lifted it himself, or had his apprentice do it. No forklifts, no conveyor belts, just human muscle and maybe a cart if you were lucky. When a blacksmith needed to shape metal, he heated it in a fire he had to maintain himself, and hammered it by hand until his arms felt like they might fall off. When a scribe needed to make a copy of a book, he sat there and wrote out every single word by hand, probably ruining his eyesight in the process. Carpentry, masonry, textile work, all of it was hands-on, physically demanding labour that would leave modern workers collapsed in exhaustion after a few hours. Yet despite these harsh conditions and the physical toll these professions took, medieval workers developed remarkable expertise. A master craftsperson after decades in their trade possessed knowledge and skills that were genuinely impressive. They understood their materials intimately, knew exactly how those materials would behave under different conditions, and could produce high-quality work using tools that most modern people wouldn't know what to do with. These weren't unskilled labourers. These were professionals who had invested years in learning their craft and who took genuine pride in their work. The social status of these various professions varied wildly, and not always in ways that make obvious sense to modern minds. Some jobs that were essential to daily life were looked down upon, while others that seem relatively minor commanded respect. Wealth didn't necessarily correlate with status either. You could have a relatively poor-skilled craftsperson who was respected in the community, and a wealthy merchant who people whispered about behind his back. The medieval social hierarchy was complicated, contradictory, and honestly pretty arbitrary when you examine it closely. What united all these professions, regardless of status or income or specific trade, was the simple fact that they kept medieval civilization running. While nobles fought their wars and clergy managed souls, these ordinary workers fed cities, clothed populations, built structures, maintained infrastructure, and produced the countless goods and services that human beings needed to survive and occasionally even thrive. They were the invisible foundation supporting everything else, invisible in historical records anyway. Most of these workers left no written trace of their existence. We know they were there because their products survived, because occasional legal documents mentioned them, because artists sometimes depicted them in the backgrounds of paintings and manuscripts. But their individual stories, their specific struggles and triumphs and daily frustrations, those are mostly lost to time. The keepers of the land, shepherds and herders. Let's start with one of the least glamorous but most essential jobs in the medieval economy, shepherding. And before you start picturing some peaceful pastoral scene with a guy in a robe playing a flute, while fluffy sheep graze contentedly on a sun-drenched hillside, let me stop you right there. Real medieval shepherding was about as far from that idyllic image as you can get while still technically involving sheep. Shepherds were the unsung heroes of medieval economic life, though calling them heroes might be generous considering most people barely acknowledged their existence, except when mutton prices went up. These were the folks who spent months at a time in complete solitude on mountain pastures and distant meadows, far from any human settlement that might offer basic amenities like shelter or conversation or other people. We're talking about profound isolation, the kind where your most meaningful social interaction for weeks on end might be with a sheep who you've named and who you're pretty sure is judging your life choices. The work required an extraordinary depth of knowledge about animals, weather patterns, and landscape features that most medieval people never bothered to acquire because they were too busy doing literally anything else. A good shepherd needed to understand sheep behaviour intimately, which is more complicated than you might think given that sheep have a reputation for being about as intelligent as a bag of wool. They had to recognise the subtle signs that indicated illness or distress, know which plants were nutritious and which would poison the flock, understand seasonal patterns in vegetation growth, and basically serve as a combination veterinarian. Nutritionist and security guard without any formal training in any of those fields. Weather prediction was another crucial skill, not the kind of weather prediction where you check an app on your phone and see a cute little icon indicating rain. More like reading the sky, wind patterns, temperature changes, and animal behaviour to guess whether you needed to move the flock to shelter before a storm hit. Get it wrong and you might lose half your flock to exposure, which would probably result in you losing half your expected income, and possibly all of your job. No pressure. Understanding the landscape was equally vital. Shepherds needed to know where the best grazing was at different times of year, which paths were safe to take with a flock, where water sources were located, and which areas belonged to which landowners, this last bit being particularly important. Because wandering onto the wrong person's property with several hundred sheep could escalate from awkward to violent remarkably quickly. They had to memorise terrain features over vast areas, often in regions where a wrong turn could lead the flock into dangerous territory, like ravines, marshes, or areas frequented by predators. GPS would have been life-changing for medieval shepherds, but instead they had to rely on memory, observation, and probably a considerable amount of luck. Then there was the actual job of protecting the flocks from threats, and there were plenty of threats. Wolves were the obvious danger, and depending on the region, they could be a constant problem. A shepherd might spend night after night keeping watch, trying to stay alert in the darkness while wolves circled the flock, looking for an opportunity to drag off a sheep. You had a staff, maybe a dog if you were fortunate enough to have one, and that was pretty much it for defensive equipment. No firearms, no motion sensors, no calling for backup. Just you and your stick against a pack of hungry wolves who had evolved over millennia to be extremely good at killing exactly the kind of animals you were trying to protect. Bears posed another threat in many regions, and unlike wolves, they weren't particularly intimidated by a guy with a stick. A bear could destroy an entire flock if it decided to, and there wasn't much a lone shepherd could do except make noise and hope the bear found easier prey elsewhere. In some areas, wildcats, lynxes, or other predators also stalked the flocks. The shepherd's job was essentially to be a permanent deterrent, a human presence that kept predators away through sheer stubborn continuity. But wild animals weren't the only threat. Human thieves were arguably worse because they could plan and organise and generally be more creative in their approach to stealing your livelihood. Rustlers knew the value of sheep and wool, and a well-timed theft could net them a significant profit with relatively low risk compared to other forms of crime. A shepherd sleeping during their watch might wake up to discover half the flock gone. A shepherd who left the flock unguarded even briefly might return to find the most valuable animals missing. Some thieves worked in groups, overwhelming a lone shepherd through numbers. Others were more subtle, picking off animals one or two at a time over weeks, hoping the losses would be attributed to predators or disease. The living conditions for shepherds range from barely adequate to genuinely terrible. During the months spent on mountain pastures or distant grazing lands, shepherds lived in crude shelters that wouldn't meet any modern definition of housing. We're talking about structures made from stone, turf, and whatever wood was available, often little more than a roof and partial walls that kept out the worst of the rain and wind, but not much else. Not exactly a five-star accommodation. No running water, no sanitation facilities, no heating beyond what a small fire might provide. In winter, conditions went from uncomfortable to legitimately dangerous, with shepherds huddling in their inadequate shelters during storms, hoping they'd survive until morning. The cold was relentless. Mountain nights could be freezing even in summer, and winter brought temperatures that could kill. Shepherds wore what clothing they had, probably slept in it too, and hoped their fire didn't go out during the night. Frostbite, hypothermia, and general exposure-related ailments were occupational hazards. Some shepherds didn't survive the winter months, succumbing to cold, illness, or accidents in the harsh mountain environment. Their bodies might not be found until spring, if they were found at all. The isolation took a psychological toll that's hard to overstate. Human beings are social creatures, and spending months alone except for sheep can do strange things to your mental state. Shepherds talked to their sheep, sang to them, probably had full conversations with them despite the sheep's limited ability to respond meaningfully. Some reportedly went a bit odd, developing eccentric behaviours or beliefs that made them even more isolated when they did return to human society. The loneliness must have been crushing at times, broken only by the occasional visit from someone bringing supplies or checking on the flock. And yet, despite these harsh conditions and genuine dangers, shepherding was considered a low-status occupation. The people doing this incredibly difficult skilled work that was essential to the medieval economy were looked down upon by society. Part of this was classism. Shepherds were poor, dirty from months outdoors, smelled like sheep, and lacked the social graces that came from regular human interaction. Part of it was the nature of the work itself. Spending all day with animals was considered less dignified than many other occupations. Part of it was simply medieval society's tendency to undervalue the people doing the actual work that kept everything running. But here's the irony. Shepherds possessed valuable knowledge and skills that made them irreplaceable in the rural economy. They understood sheep breeding in ways that directly impacted wool quality and quantity. Wool was one of the medieval economy's most important commodities, driving trade networks across Europe and beyond. The quality of wool a region produced could make or break its textile industry, and that quality started with how sheep were bred and raised. Shepherds knew which rams produced the best offspring, which bloodlines had desirable traits, which animals should be culled from the breeding population. This wasn't written down in books. It was practical knowledge passed from experienced shepherds to apprentices, refined over generations. Cheesemaking was another crucial skill shepherds developed. While sheep were grazing in distant pastures, their milk needed to be processed rather than wasted. Shepherds learned to make various types of cheese, often producing distinctive regional varieties that became local specialties. The knowledge of how to properly culture milk, when to add rennet, how long to age cheese in different conditions, all of this was shepherding knowledge that had economic value far beyond the shepherd's personal income. They also understood pasture management in sophisticated ways. Modern farmers with their soil science degrees and agricultural extension services have formally codified what good shepherds knew intuitively: how to rotate grazing areas to prevent overuse, which plants indicated healthy versus degraded pasture. How? Different grazing patterns affected long-term pasture productivity. A skilled shepherd could keep flocks healthy on marginal land that others might consider unsuitable, or maximize production from good pasture through careful management. This knowledge directly impacted the landowner's wealth and the region's economic output. The relationship between shepherds and landowners was often fraught with tension, despite this mutual dependence. Shepherds needed access to grazing lands, but land ownership was a complicated and contentious issue throughout the Middle Ages. Common lands where anyone could graze their animals were gradually being enclosed and privatized, a process that benefited landowners but hurt shepherds and small farmers who depended on common access. Disputes over grazing rights could turn ugly, sometimes escalating to violence when shepherds insisted on traditional access and landowners insisted on their property rights. The economic arrangements varied by region and time period, but shepherds generally didn't own the flocks they tended. They worked for landowners, monasteries, or wealthy individuals who owned the sheep and paid the shepherd a wage or a share of the profits. This meant shepherds bore much of the risk. If the flock was lost to disease, predators, or theft, the shepherd might be held responsible and forced to compensate the owner, but received relatively little of the reward. A successful year with healthy lambs and high-quality wool primarily enriched the owner, with the shepherd receiving their pre-agreed compensation regardless of productivity. Some shepherds did manage to accumulate their own small flocks over time, building modest wealth through careful management and saving. These were the success stories, the ones who went from landless labourers to small-scale flock owners. But for every shepherd who managed this, many more spent their entire lives working others' animals, never accumulating enough resources to start their own operation. The path from shepherd to flock owner existed theoretically, but practically it required luck, extraordinary skill, and opportunities that didn't come along often. The seasonal rhythm of shepherding created a complex annual cycle. Spring brought lambing season, when shepherds needed to be constantly vigilant, helping with difficult births, protecting newborns from predators and cold, ensuring mothers and lambs bonded properly. This was perhaps the most intense period of the year, with shepherds barely sleeping as they managed the influx of new animals. Summer meant moving flocks to high mountain pastures where vegetation was rich, a migration that required coordinating dozens or hundreds of animals over challenging terrain. Autumn brought shearing and the preparation for winter, sorting out which animals would be kept for breeding and which would be culled. Winter was about survival, keeping the flock alive through cold and scarce forage until spring began the cycle again. The tools shepherds used were remarkably simple: a staff for walking and managing the flock, a knife for various tasks, perhaps a sling for driving off predators, warm clothing, and basic supplies for cheese making and survival. That was basically it. No sophisticated equipment, no backup systems, just these simple tools and the shepherd's knowledge and experience. The staff became iconic, a shepherd's trademark implement that served multiple purposes, as a walking stick on rough terrain, as a tool for guiding sheep, as a weapon against predators, and as support during long hours standing watch. A good staff could last years, and might be the most valuable tool a shepherd owned. Dogs were invaluable when available, but not all shepherds had access to trained herding dogs. These animals were expensive and required their own care and feeding. A good herding dog could do the work of several people, helping to move and control the flock with an intelligence and instinct that made the shepherd's job vastly easier. The relationship between shepherd and dog often became the closest thing to companionship a shepherd had during months in isolation. Someone, even if it was technically a dog, who understood the work and could communicate after a fashion about it. Despite the hardships, shepherding attracted people for various reasons beyond simply needing employment. Some genuinely preferred the solitude and independence, finding the isolation refreshing rather than oppressive. Others came from families with shepherding traditions and followed that path out of familiarity and available training. Some were escaping problems in their villages or towns, finding in shepherding's isolation a way to leave their past behind. And some simply had no better options. Shepherding would hire people that other professions might reject, offering at least a subsistence living to those with few alternatives. The knowledge shepherds accumulated about their region's natural environment was often encyclopedic. They knew medicinal plants that grew wild, understood animal behavior across many species, could predict weather patterns with impressive accuracy, and possessed geographical knowledge of remote areas that few others ever visited. This made shepherds valuable sources of information for travelers, merchants, or military forces moving through unfamiliar territory, though whether shepherds chose to share this knowledge with strangers was another matter entirely. What's striking about medieval shepherding is how it combined genuine skill and important economic functions with low social status and poor compensation. This wasn't unique to shepherding. Many medieval professions shared this contradiction, but it's particularly stark in this case. The people ensuring a steady supply of wool, meat, milk, and cheese were doing skilled work that required intelligence, dedication, and courage, yet society treated them as barely worth noticing except when something went wrong. It's a pattern you'll see repeated across many of the professions we're going to discuss. Essential workers performing crucial tasks while receiving minimal recognition or reward for their efforts. The legacy of medieval shepherding persists in multiple ways. The pastoral traditions established during this period influenced later agricultural practices. The sheep breeds developed through medieval breeding programs became foundations for modern varieties. The routes shepherds established moving flocks between seasonal pastures are still used in some regions today. And the image of the shepherd, romanticized and sanitized beyond recognition, became an enduring cultural symbol despite bearing little resemblance to the harsh reality of the actual profession. So the next time you see an idealized painting of a shepherd contentedly watching sheep on a perfect meadow, remember the real version. Someone spending months in isolation on a cold mountainside, fighting off wolves with a stick, sleeping in a drafty stone hut, and getting paid barely enough to survive, all while performing skilled work that helped drive one of medieval Europe's most important industries. Not quite as picturesque, but considerably more impressive as an actual human accomplishment. And that tension between reality and image is something we'll see again and again as we explore the other ordinary professions that built the medieval world. Now let's talk about someone who occupied one of the strangest positions in medieval society, the miller. If you wanted to understand medieval contradictions in human form, the miller was your guy. These were people who performed an absolutely essential service that everyone needed, made decent money doing it, and yet somehow managed to be simultaneously respected for their skills and deeply mistrusted by pretty much everyone in the community. It's like being the only dentist in town. People need you, but that doesn't mean they're happy about it. The mill itself was genuinely the heart of the medieval village, not metaphorically, literally the centre of economic life for the entire area. Every bit of grain that farmers spent months growing and carefully harvesting needed to be ground into flour before it could become bread, and bread was the foundation of the medieval diet. We're not talking about bread as a side dish here. This was the main event, the primary source of calories for most people, the difference between eating and starving. So the person who controlled access to flour production wielded considerable power, which is a nice way of saying they had you over a barrel and everyone knew it. Here's where things get interesting from a business perspective. Mills operated under a system that would make modern antitrust lawyers start hyperventilating, the monopoly. In most areas, the local lord owned the mill and granted the miller exclusive rights to grind all grain within a specific district. Peasants were legally required to use that mill and no other. They couldn't grind their grain at home using hand mills, even though that technology existed and was simpler. They couldn't travel to a neighbouring mill if they didn't like the service or prices. They had to use the designated mill, pay whatever fee the miller charged, and hope they got back approximately the amount of flour they were owed. Their idea of customer service was definitely more take it or leave it, except you legally couldn't leave it. This monopoly system had a certain economic logic from the lord's perspective. Mills were expensive to build and maintain, requiring significant capital investment in complex machinery, construction of the building, and often elaborate water management systems for water mills, or the tower, a mechanism for windmills. Granting a monopoly ensured the mill would be profitable enough to justify this investment and provide revenue to the lord through fees or rent. For the miller, it meant guaranteed business and the opportunity to become relatively prosperous. For everyone else, it meant having no choice and no leverage, which understandably made them bitter. The fees millers charged were often a percentage of the grain, typically somewhere between 1/10 and 1/16 of what you brought in, depending on local custom and how much the miller thought he could get away with. So you'd arrive with a sack of grain, wait your turn while the mill processed other people's grain, and eventually receive back flour that weighed noticeably less than what you brought in. The miller would explain that some weight was lost in the grinding process, which was technically true. Husks were removed, some material became dust and chaff, but there was widespread suspicion that millers were helping themselves to more than their entitled share. Not exactly an unfounded suspicion, given that some millers definitely were. This brings us to the miller's reputation problem. Millers were almost universally suspected of cheating their customers. Medieval literature is full of stories, jokes, and cautionary tales about dishonest millers who used rigged scales, kept extra flour for themselves, mixed inferior grain into the output, or employed various other schemes to skim additional profit. Some of these stories were undoubtedly based on real incidents. When you have a monopoly and limited oversight, the temptation to cheat must have been considerable, but the stereotype became so pervasive that even honest millers couldn't escape it. You could be the most scrupulously fair miller in the kingdom, but people would still count their flour suspiciously and mutter about short weights. The problem was that proving cheating was difficult. Grain and flour don't weigh exactly the same, and the conversion wasn't perfectly consistent. Different grains had different properties, moisture content varied, grinding fineness affected volume versus weight. There were enough legitimate variables that it was hard to prove your flour was short because the miller stole some versus normal. Processing variation. And even if you were certain the miller was cheating you, what were you going to do about it? You still needed flour, the miller still had the only legal mill for miles, and complaining to the lord who collected revenue from the mill might not get you the sympathetic hearing you hoped for. But let's talk about the actual work of being a miller, because it wasn't all counting money while peasants glared at you resentfully. Running a mill required genuine technical expertise that took years to develop. These weren't simple machines. Watermills used complex systems of gears, shafts, and millstones that had to be precisely calibrated and constantly maintained. The miller needed to understand how water flow affected the wheel's rotation speed, how to adjust the gap between millstones for different types of grain, and desired fineness, how to keep the machinery from vibrating itself apart, and how to prevent the millstones from overheating and potentially sparking fires that could destroy the entire structure. Water management alone was an art form. The miller had to read the river or stream, understanding how water levels change with seasons and weather, how to adjust gates and sluices to control flow, where sediment was accumulating and threatening to redirect the current, how to prevent ice from damaging the wheel in winter. A good miller could predict when drought or flood might affect operations and prepare accordingly. A poor miller might wake up to find the wheel damaged by debris that came downstream during the night, or discover that dropping water levels left the wheel barely turning and unable to power the grinding. Windmills brought their own technical challenges. The miller needed to understand wind patterns, when to deploy the sails and when to furl them, how to turn the mill to face the wind, a process that in early windmills required physically rotating the entire structure using a long tail pole. Get this wrong and the sails might spin too fast and tear, or the mill might try to turn in the wrong direction with catastrophic results. Wind was less predictable than water, meaning windmill operators needed to be constantly attentive to changing conditions. The work was less about patience and more about vigilance and quick reactions. The millstones themselves required specialized knowledge and regular maintenance. These weren't just any rocks. They were carefully selected and shaped stones, often imported from quarries known for producing particularly good milling stone. The grinding surfaces needed to be regularly dressed, meaning the miller used special tools to cut new grooves and restore the rough texture that actually did the grinding. This was skilled, dangerous work done with the stones in place, requiring the miller to work in confined spaces around machinery that could crush limbs if something went wrong. A poorly dressed millstone ground inefficiently produced inferior flour and might overheat or crack. Equipment broke constantly. All this machinery, wooden gears, iron fittings, leather belts, whatever the mill used for its particular design, was under tremendous stress. Gears wore down or broke teeth, shafts cracked, bearings failed, belts stretched or snapped. The miller needed to be an accomplished carpenter, metalworker, and general mechanic, able to diagnose problems and either fix them himself or direct repairs. When something broke, the mill stopped working, which meant angry customers, lost income, and a backlog that would take days to clear. Preventive maintenance was crucial, but given that the machinery was made with medieval materials and standards, things broke anyway. The working hours were punishing and often strange. Mills operated whenever there was grain to grind, which during harvest season might mean around-the-clock operations. Farmers needed their grain processed quickly so it wouldn't spoil, and so they could pay their obligations to the Lord and still have time to prepare for winter. The miller couldn't simply stop working at sunset like most medieval labourers. If there was work to be done and the mill could operate, it operated. Water mills could run at night with the miller or an assistant managing the machinery by torchlight and sound, developing an almost supernatural ability to detect problems just from subtle changes in the mechanical rhythm. This nighttime operation contributed significantly to the miller's weird reputation. Picture it from a medieval peasant's perspective. You're lying in your cottage trying to sleep and you can hear the mill grinding away in the darkness, producing this rhythmic rumbling and creaking that carries across the village. The miller is up there working at hours when normal people are asleep, doing something technical and vaguely mysterious involving fire and complex machinery and the transformation of grain into flour. It doesn't take much imagination to start wondering if something else might be going on. Add in the fact that mills were usually positioned somewhat apart from the village, either on the river or on a hill for wind, and you have perfect conditions for rumours about secretive activities. The accusations of witchcraft and involvement in dark dealings weren't just about suspicious personalities. Mills were genuinely eerie places that seemed to operate according to rules beyond normal understanding. The machinery made strange sounds, the stones heated up during operation, sparks sometimes flew, and the whole structure shook and groaned in ways that could seem supernatural if you didn't understand the mechanics. The miller understood it all, which from the outside might look like command over mysterious forces. In a society where most people had no technical education and limited understanding of machinery, The person who could harness water or wind to grind grain might seem like someone who had access to knowledge that ordinary people didn't, knowledge that might extend to other, less wholesome subjects. The isolation of the mill and miller contributed to this outsider status. Mills needed to be where the water or wind was, not where it was most convenient for the community. This meant millers often lived at their mills, somewhat removed from the village centre. They spent their days and nights with machinery rather than people, developing an intimacy with wheels and stones and gears that probably struck others as odd. Social interaction was mostly limited to customers dropping off grain and picking up flour, transactions that were often tense given the suspicion of cheating. It wasn't a recipe for developing close community ties. Yet for all the suspicion and accusations, successful millers could become genuinely prosperous. That monopoly might be resented, but it was also profitable. A miller who operated efficiently, maintained his equipment well, and managed his finances competently could accumulate wealth that put him well above average peasants, and even many skilled craftspeople. Some millers owned property beyond their mills, lent money, and generally operated as substantial figures in the local economy. Their children might receive education and move up the social ladder. The profession offered opportunities for advancement that were uncommon in medieval society. The mill itself often became valuable property that could be passed down through families, creating dynasties of millers who operated the same mill for generations. Sons learned the trade from fathers, inheriting not just the building and equipment, but the accumulated knowledge of that particular mill's quirks and requirements. They learned which sounds meant trouble, how that specific water wheel behaved in different seasons, what maintenance that set of millstones needed. This experiential knowledge was worth more than the physical property in many ways. The relationship between miller and lord was complex. The lord depended on the mill for revenue and needed it to operate efficiently to keep his peasants productive and his own grain processed. A miller who let the mill fall into disrepair or who antagonized customers so badly that they found illegal ways to avoid using the mill was a problem. But the lord also needed the miller to enforce the monopoly and extract the maximum value from it, which often meant tolerating some degree of sharp practice that kept the miller profitable and thus able to pay his fees or rent to the lord. It was a delicate balance between exploitation and economic necessity. During times of famine or poor harvests, the miller became an even more controversial figure. When grain was scarce and flour prices were high, the miller's fees became that much more painful. People who were already struggling to feed their families had to surrender a portion of their precious grain to someone who was clearly doing better than they were. The resentment could turn to anger, and mills sometimes became targets of riots or attacks by desperate, hungry communities. A miller during famine needed to be careful about how much he charged and how conspicuously he displayed his relative prosperity. The technical knowledge millers possessed extended beyond just operating the mill. They understood grain in ways that farmers might not, which varieties ground best for different purposes, how moisture content affected grinding, how to detect spoilage or contamination, what the flour quality indicated about the original grain. This expertise gave millers insight into local agricultural productivity and could make them valuable sources of information about harvest quality and potential food security issues. Some millers leveraged this knowledge into broader business activities, becoming grain merchants or advisors on agricultural matters. Mills themselves varied considerably in sophistication and output. A small water mill in a remote village might have a single pair of millstones and handle just enough grain to serve the local population. Large mills in prosperous areas might have multiple sets of stones operating simultaneously, processing grain from a wide region and producing flour on an almost industrial scale. Some specialized in particular types of grinding: flour mills for wheat and rye, malt mills for brewing, fulling mills for textile processing. Each specialization required its own expertise and attracted its own type of customer. The social position of millers remained ambiguous throughout the medieval period. They weren't noble, but they often had more wealth than many people who technically outranked them socially. They provided essential services, but they were suspected of dishonesty. They possessed valuable skills, but they worked with their hands in ways that put them below learned professions. They could be influential local figures, but they were also somewhat isolated from community life. It was a contradictory existence that probably required a certain personality type, someone who could tolerate being needed but not particularly liked, prosperous but not respected. What's particularly interesting is how the stereotype of the dishonest miller persisted across centuries and cultures. From England to Italy to Germany, the miller who cheats his customers appears in stories, jokes, and literature. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales includes a miller who's a thief and brawler. This widespread consistency suggests the stereotype had some basis in reality. Enough millers behaved badly that the reputation stuck to the entire profession. But it also suggests that something about the structural position of millers, the monopoly, the isolation, the power over a necessity, created conditions that bred resentment regardless of individual behaviour. The decline of the feudal system and its associated monopolies eventually changed the miller's position. As restrictions on grain grinding loosened and competition became possible, millers had to compete on service and price rather than relying on captive customers. Some adapted successfully, others failed. But during the height of the medieval period, the miller occupied this unique niche, simultaneously essential and mistrusted, skilled and suspected, prosperous and isolated. Understanding the miller helps illuminate broader contradictions in medieval economic life, where necessity often trumped preference, and where monopolies created wealth, but also resentment. Weavers and cloth makers, the foundation of the textile empire. If you want to understand medieval economic power, follow the cloth. While knights got the glory and kings got the crowns, the people who actually generated massive amounts of wealth were the ones turning wool into fabric. The textile industry was one of the largest and most economically significant sectors in medieval Europe, driving trade networks that spanned continents, enriching entire cities, and occasionally causing political upheavals when something disrupted. The supply chain. And at the heart of this enormous industry were weavers, people who spent their days at looms, turning thread into cloth that clothed everyone from peasants to princes. Weavers were the backbone of textile production, which sounds like one of those things people say to make a profession sound more important than it actually is, but in this case was literally true. You could have the best wool, the finest thread, the most skilled dyers in the world, but without weavers to turn thread into cloth, none of it mattered. They were the essential link in the chain that transformed raw materials into finished products, and the scale of this work was staggering. Every piece of clothing, every blanket, every banner, every tapestry, every single textile item anyone used had to be woven by hand, one thread at a time. The weaving process itself was complex and required significant skill, though it's easy to underestimate this from a distance of several centuries. Modern people are used to machine-woven cloth that's perfectly uniform, and produced at speeds that would seem like magic to a medieval weaver. Medieval weaving was all manual labour, requiring the weaver to maintain consistent tension on threads, work pedals or treadles, to create the shed through which the shuttle passed, throw the shuttle across the loom with precision, and beat the weft. Threads into place with consistent force. Do all of this wrong and you'd get loose weaving, uneven fabric, or cloth that was weaker than it should be. Do it right for hour after hour, and you'd produce high-quality fabric that could last years of hard use. The different types of cloth required different techniques and skills. Coarse linen for peasant clothes was relatively straightforward. Sturdy, practical fabric that didn't need to be fancy, but did need to be durable. Wool cloth came in a vast range of qualities, from rough material suitable for work clothes to fine broadcloths and worsteds that nobles would pay premium prices for. The finer the cloth, the more skill required to weave it. Luxury fabrics like silk demanded not only exceptional technique but also different types of looms and specialized knowledge. A weaver who could produce high-quality fine cloth was worth considerably more than one who could only manage basic materials. The work itself was physically demanding in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Yes, the weaver was sitting down, which sounds easy compared to labourers doing heavy lifting or farm work. But sitting in the same position for 10 or 12 hours a day, repeating the same motions thousands of times, maintaining precise control over foot pedals and hand movements, this created its own form of exhaustion and physical wear. Backs and shoulders ached from hunching over the loom. Hands developed calluses and sometimes cramped from the repetitive motions. Legs grew sore from working the treadles. It was marathon-level endurance work disguised as sedentary labour. The eye strain was particularly brutal. Weavers worked with threads that might be fine and similar in colour, trying to maintain pattern precision and spot any flaws or breaks in the material, all under lighting conditions that by modern standards would be considered criminal. Candles or oil lamps didn't provide anything like adequate illumination for close work. Daylight varied by season and weather, and there were no glasses to correct vision problems beyond crude magnifying lenses that might or might not help. Weavers commonly developed vision problems as they aged, with many effectively going blind from decades of close work in poor light. Not exactly the retirement plan anyone hoped for. Then there was the respiratory toll. Working with wool meant constant exposure to wool dust, tiny fibres that filled the air around the loom and were steadily inhaled throughout the working day. Over years, this led to lung problems that we'd now recognise as occupational disease, but that medieval people just accepted as the normal decline that came with being a weaver. Chronic coughing, difficulty breathing, general weakness — these were so common among older weavers that they were considered inevitable rather than preventable. The concept of workplace safety equipment didn't really exist, so weavers just breathed in whatever their materials released and hoped for the best. The work was also relentlessly monotonous. Weaving was repetitive by nature. Throw the shuttle, beat the threads, change the shed, throw the shuttle back, beat again, repeat, for hours, for days, for years. Some weavers found a rhythm in it, almost meditative in its repetitiveness. Others found it mind-numbingly dull and probably spent their days thinking about literally anything other than the cloth slowly growing on their loom. The monotony was broken only by the need to prepare new thread, fix breaks, adjust tensions, or switch to a new piece, but mostly it was the same motions over and over until the cloth was finished. Despite these harsh conditions, or perhaps because of them, in a backwards kind of way, successful weavers could become genuinely wealthy. The textile industry generated enormous profits, and skilled weavers producing high-quality cloth could command good prices for their work. In major textile centres like Flanders, Florence, and various English towns, the most accomplished weavers operated substantial businesses, employed apprentices and journeymen, and accumulated property and capital. They weren't nobility, but they had comfortable homes, adequate food, and financial security that most medieval people couldn't imagine. The guild system played a crucial role in weavers' prosperity and power. Weaver guilds emerged as some of the most powerful organisations in medieval cities, controlling who could practice the trade, setting quality standards, regulating prices, and generally protecting their members' interests with remarkable effectiveness. These weren't just social clubs. They were economic and political power structures that could influence city governance, negotiate with nobles, and occasionally cause serious trouble if they felt their interests were threatened. The fact that cloth production was so valuable gave weaver guilds leverage that most craft organisations lacked. In textile centres like Ghent, Bruges, and Florence, weaver guilds wielded political power that rivaled or sometimes exceeded that of traditional authorities. They could organise strikes that paralysed the local economy, they fielded military forces during conflicts, they negotiated trade agreements and defended their members' economic interests against merchants, nobles, and rival cities. The famous Ciompi revolt in Florence in 1378 saw wool workers briefly seize control of the city government. Not an isolated incident, but rather an extreme example of the political assertiveness that characterised guild organisations in the textile industry. The relationship between weavers and the merchant class was often tense. Merchants controlled access to raw materials and to markets for finished cloth, giving them considerable leverage over weavers who needed both wool to work with and buyers for their products. Merchants could effectively set prices at both ends of the transaction, potentially squeezing weavers' profit margins. This created a structural conflict where weavers organised collectively to resist merchant power, while merchants tried to weaken guild controls that limited their ability to cut costs and maximise profits. The resulting disputes could be bitter and sometimes violent. The production of cloth involved a whole chain of workers beyond just weavers, creating a complex textile economy with multiple specialised occupations. Spinners, mostly women working in their homes, turned raw wool into thread. Dyers treated the finished cloth with colours that range from simple earth tones to expensive imported dyes like woad and madder. Fullers cleaned and thickened woolen cloth by pounding it in water with various substances, a process that was physically demanding and incredibly important for final quality. Shearers trimmed the surface of cloth to create an even finish. Each step required its own expertise and contributed to the final product's quality and value. Weavers occupied a middle position in this chain, dependent on spinners for their thread supply and on the various finishing trades to prepare their cloth for market, but also central to the entire process in ways that gave them significant importance. A shortage of skilled weavers could bottleneck the entire industry, driving up labour costs and potentially enriching weavers at the expense of other participants. Conversely, too many weavers competing for work could depress wages and force some out of the trade. The balance of supply and demand for weaving labour fluctuated constantly, creating an uncertain economic environment. The technology of weaving advanced slowly during the medieval period, with significant innovations appearing gradually and spreading unevenly across regions. Improvements in loom design increased efficiency and enabled production of more complex patterns. The horizontal treadle loom became standard, allowing for faster work than earlier vertical looms. Draw looms enabled weaving of elaborate figured fabrics that commanded premium prices. These technological advances meant that weavers needed to continually update their skills to remain competitive, and that older weavers trained on obsolete equipment might find their expertise becoming less valuable. Training to become a weaver involved a lengthy apprenticeship, typically lasting several years. The apprentice learned not just the mechanical process of weaving, but also how to select and prepare materials, maintain and repair the loom, judge cloth quality, and understand the business aspects of the trade. This was genuine education that produced skilled professionals, not just workers who could follow simple instructions. The apprenticeship system ensured quality standards were maintained while also limiting the number of new weavers entering the profession. Guilds carefully controlled how many apprentices could be trained, protecting existing weavers from excessive competition. The social status of weavers varied considerably depending on their specialization and success. A master weaver producing luxury cloth for wealthy clients occupied a very different social position than someone weaving basic materials in a small town. Successful weavers in major textile centers could live comfortably, associate with merchants and minor nobles, and provide their children with education and opportunities for advancement. Less successful weavers might struggle economically and socially, working long hours for modest returns and lacking the resources to establish themselves securely. Women participated in weaving throughout the medieval period, though their access to the most prestigious and profitable work was often restricted by guild regulations that favoured men. Many women worked as weavers in their homes, producing cloth for their families or taking on piecework from merchants. Widows of master weavers sometimes continued operating their late husbands' workshops, maintaining the business and employing workers despite guild rules that nominally excluded women from full membership. The textile industry depended heavily on female labour, even as women's contributions were often undervalued and their opportunities for advancement limited. The economic importance of textiles created vulnerability to disruptions. Wars could cut trade routes and restrict access to raw materials or markets. Plague reduced the labour force and disrupted production. Changes in fashion could suddenly reduce demand for certain types of cloth, while increasing it for others. Economic depressions reduced purchasing power and hurt sales. Political conflicts between cities or regions could lead to trade embargoes that devastated textile industries dependent on imported materials or export markets. Weavers and other textile workers faced an uncertain economic future, despite working in a generally prosperous industry. Regional specialization emerged as different areas developed reputations for particular types of cloth. Flemish cities became famous for high-quality woolens, Italian centres for luxury fabrics, English towns for various grades of wool cloth. These regional specializations created trade networks that moved raw materials to production centres and finished cloth to markets across Europe and beyond. A weaver in Bruges might work with English wool, dyes from the Mediterranean, and produce cloth destined for German merchants to sell in Eastern European markets. The global nature of medieval textile trade connected weavers to an economic system that spanned continents. The wealth generated by textile production contributed to urban growth and development. Cities that successfully established textile industries attracted workers, generated tax revenue, financed impressive civic and religious buildings, and generally prospered in ways that agricultural regions couldn't match. The skylines of medieval Flanders and northern Italy, with their bell towers and guild halls and churches, were built on wealth created by turning wool into cloth. Those impressive civic monuments represented generations of weavers spending their days at looms, producing the exports that enriched their cities. The daily life of a typical weaver followed patterns dictated by light and productivity demands. Work began early, taking advantage of morning light, and continued as long as vision permitted. Breaks for meals were brief, Time away from the loom was time not producing cloth, and thus not earning income. Weaving was often a family enterprise, with children helping with simple tasks, spouses handling associated work like thread preparation, and everyone contributing to the household's production. The loom dominated the household's living space and schedule, a constant presence that defined family life. The sounds and smells of textile production would have been pervasive in weaving districts. The rhythmic sounds of shuttles and beating combined with the creak of treadles created a distinctive soundscape. The smell of wool, lanolin, dirt, animal odour, mixed with dyes, sizing compounds and human sweat in confined working spaces. These sensory experiences defined the textile workers' world, marking them as members of a particular occupational community even when they weren't actively working. Looking at medieval weaving from a modern perspective reveals how much the Industrial Revolution changed textile production. What required hours of skilled manual labour can now be done by machines in seconds. The quality that medieval luxury weavers achieved with effort and expertise is now the baseline standard for machine-made cloth. But examining the medieval textile industry also reveals the complexity and sophistication of pre-industrial manufacturing, the skill of craftspeople working with simple tools, and the economic importance of industries we now take entirely for granted. Those weavers sitting at their looms day after day, creating the cloth that literally held medieval society together, they deserve recognition as the skilled professionals they were, even if their work environment would make modern occupational. Health and safety inspectors weep. Let's talk about the people who quite literally kept medieval society from starving, bakers. And before we go any further, let's establish something important. When medieval people talked about bread, they weren't referring to some optional carbohydrate you might have with dinner if you're feeling fancy. Bread was the foundation of the entire diet, the main event, the thing that stood between you and malnutrition. Most people were getting something like 70% of their calories from bread, which means the person making that bread wasn't just providing a service, they were performing a function so essential that societies treated it almost like a public utility. This is why bakers occupied such a strictly regulated position in medieval society. We're talking about regulations that would make modern health inspectors look relaxed by comparison. City authorities controlled bread prices, weights, quality standards, ingredients, and basically every aspect of the baking trade with an attention to detail that bordered on obsessive. And for good reason, bad bread could trigger riots. Underweight loaves could cause public disturbances. A baker caught cheating on weights or quality could face punishments ranging from fines to public humiliation to actual physical harm. The medieval equivalent of consumer protection was alive and well when it came to bread. The working day for a baker started at hours that would make modern early risers weep. We're talking about 2 or 3 in the morning, when sensible people were still deep in sleep and wouldn't be conscious for several more hours. But bread needed to be ready when customers wanted it, which was first thing in the morning, which meant bakers needed to have finished their work before dawn. The process took time. Fires had to be lit and brought to the right temperature. Dough had to be mixed and kneaded. Loaves had to be shaped and allowed to rise. Everything had to be baked carefully to avoid burning or undercooking. No room for sleeping in when your entire customer base expected fresh bread at sunrise. The physical labour was substantial. Mixing and kneading dough for hours on end built impressive upper body strength. Bakers typically had arms and shoulders that would be the envy of modern gym enthusiasts, though they probably would have happily traded that for an extra hour of sleep. The heat from the ovens was relentless, especially in summer when working next to a roaring fire in an enclosed space created conditions that modern occupational health standards would classify as inhumane. Bakers spent their working hours sweating profusely in temperatures that would make a sauna feel comfortable, breathing air thick with flour dust and smoke. Not exactly ergonomic working conditions. The ovens themselves were massive brick structures that required considerable expertise to operate correctly. Getting the temperature right was crucial. Too hot and the bread burned on the outside while staying raw inside, too cool and it didn't bake properly. There were no thermostats or temperature gauges, so bakers developed an almost intuitive sense of oven temperature through years of experience. They might test it by throwing in a bit of flour and watching how quickly it browned, or by holding their hand near the opening and gauging the heat intensity, or simply by knowing from the colour and behaviour of the fire what temperature they had. Achieved. This was genuine expertise that took years to develop and separated competent bakers from those who produced mediocre results. The regulation of the baking trade was remarkably comprehensive. Authorities established what became known as the Assize of Bread, a complex system of regulations that connected bread prices to grain costs and mandated standard weights for different types of loaves. The idea was that as grain prices fluctuated with harvests and market conditions, bread prices would adjust proportionally, but the weight of a loaf would remain constant. This meant bakers absorbed some of the risk of grain price variations. When grain was expensive, they made less profit per loaf but couldn't reduce the size. When grain was cheap, they made better margins. The system was intended to protect consumers from price gouging, though it also meant bakers operated on relatively thin margins during difficult times. Quality standards were equally strict. Bread had to be made from specified ingredients without adulterants or fillers that might stretch the flour, but reduce nutritional value or safety. Inspectors actually checked bakeries regularly, examining ingredients, weighing loaves, assessing quality. A baker found using sawdust to extend flour, or selling underweight loaves, or producing substandard bread faced serious consequences. The punishments could be quite creative. Some cities used a punishment called the pillory, where the offending baker was locked in a wooden frame in the town square, with the bad bread hung around their neck while passers-by mocked them and potentially threw things. Other places required bakers to be dragged through the streets on a hurdle with their bad bread tied to them. These weren't just symbolic embarrassments. They were genuinely humiliating experiences designed to discourage cheating. The most severe cases could result in banishment from the trade entirely or even from the city. A baker's reputation was everything, and being publicly identified as someone who cheated customers or produced inferior products could destroy that reputation permanently. The social consequences extended beyond just professional damage. In communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, being identified as a dishonest baker meant social ostracism that affected your entire family. Your neighbors would gossip about you, your children might face bullying, your spouse would be embarrassed. The incentive structure strongly encouraged honest dealing, at least in theory. Despite these risks and regulations, or perhaps because of them, successful bakers could become genuinely prosperous. Bread was a necessity that everyone needed daily, which meant consistent demand regardless of economic conditions. A baker who operated efficiently, maintained good community relations and managed costs well could accumulate wealth that put them well above most urban workers. Some bakers owned their shops and ovens, while others rented facilities from property owners, but either way, established bakers were typically solid middle-class tradespeople with financial security that many others lacked. The capital requirements to enter the baking trade were substantial, which limited access to the profession. You needed a building suitable for baking, which meant space for ovens, storage for flour and fuel, and areas for mixing and preparation. You needed the ovens themselves, which were expensive to build and required skilled mason work. You needed mixing equipment, baking tools, and all the other implements of the trade. You needed initial inventory of flour and other ingredients. And you needed enough operating capital to survive until you'd established a customer base and regular income. All of this meant that becoming a baker typically required either substantial family wealth, a generous benefactor, or acceptance into a guild that might help finance new members. The guild system played a major role in regulating the baking trade, as it did with most medieval professions. Baker guilds controlled training through apprenticeships, set standards for professional conduct, negotiated with city authorities over regulations and fees, and generally looked after their members' collective interests. These organizations wielded considerable power. A guild could refuse to train new bakers, limiting competition for existing members, or could organize collective action if regulations or taxes became too burdensome. Membership in a good guild provided security and support that independent bakers lacked. Different types of bread required different skills and commanded different prices. White bread made from refined wheat flour was the luxury product, expensive and typically consumed only by the wealthy. Brown bread from less refined flour was more common and affordable. Rye bread was even cheaper and was the standard for poorer consumers. Barley bread sat at the bottom of the hierarchy, coarse, dense, and not particularly tasty, but filling and affordable for those with limited means. A skilled baker might produce multiple grades of bread, serving different market segments, or might specialize in one particular type and quality level. The religious calendar significantly impacted baking schedules and products. During Lent and other fasting periods, regulations prohibited certain ingredients, requiring bakers to adjust their recipes. Feast days and holy days created demand spikes that required extra production. Different seasons brought different ingredients and different customer preferences. Successful bakers learned to navigate this complex calendar of religious and seasonal variations, adapting their production to maximize sales throughout the year. Now let's shift to butchers, who occupied a social position that was somehow both elevated and looked down upon simultaneously. On one hand, meat was desirable, a luxury for many people who ate it rarely, a status symbol for those who could afford it regularly. Butchers sold something people wanted, and successful ones could become quite wealthy. On the other hand, the actual work of butchering was considered unclean in ways that made many people uncomfortable. The constant contact with blood and death, the visceral nature of transforming living animals into meat, the smells and sights and sounds of the slaughterhouse, all of this marked butchers as people who worked with death as their daily business. The work itself was physically demanding and genuinely unpleasant in ways that modern supermarket shoppers, who encounter meat as neat packages wrapped in plastic, might not fully appreciate. Butchers had to slaughter animals, which meant killing them quickly and efficiently while minimizing suffering. Easier said than done with medieval tools and techniques. They had to drain blood, remove hides, extract organs, and break down carcasses into manageable cuts. This all happened in conditions that would horrify modern food safety inspectors, outdoor or semi-outdoor facilities where flies swarmed. Temperatures were whatever the weather happened to be, and sanitation consisted of occasionally rinsing things with water and hoping for the best. The smell alone would have been remarkable. Fresh blood, animal organs, waste products, decomposition if meat sat too long in warm weather. Butcher shops and slaughterhouses created olfactory experiences that you could probably detect from several streets away. Medieval people were far more accustomed to agricultural smells than modern urban dwellers, but even by their standards, butcher areas were notably pungent. Cities often restricted where butchers could operate, pushing slaughterhouses to the edges of town or requiring butchers to dispose of waste in specific ways, though enforcement of these regulations was inconsistent at best. The religious dimension of butchering added complexity to an already complicated profession. Different religions had different rules about how animals should be killed, which animals were acceptable to eat, and how meat should be prepared. In Christian Europe, the Catholic Church regulated meat consumption through fasting rules that prohibited or restricted meat on certain days. Fridays, Lent, Ember Days, and various holy days added up to something like 150 days per year when meat consumption was limited or forbidden. This created a challenging business environment where demand fluctuated dramatically based on the religious calendar, requiring butchers to plan their inventory and slaughtering schedules carefully. The relationship between butchers and animals was necessarily complicated. These were people who worked with livestock daily, who understood animal behavior and could recognize quality breeding and good health in animals. Some probably developed genuine appreciation for or attachment to animals, but their profession required them to kill those animals efficiently and without sentimentality. It's a psychological complexity that probably required a certain temperament, someone who could appreciate animals while also viewing them primarily as products to be processed and sold. The economic structure of butchering involved significant capital investment similar to baking. Butchers needed facilities for slaughtering and processing meat, storage areas, cutting tools and equipment, and most importantly the capital to purchase livestock. Buying cattle, pigs, or sheep required substantial upfront investment before you could generate any revenue from selling meat. This meant butchers typically needed access to credit or needed to have accumulated significant wealth before entering the trade. The profession was dominated by people who came from relatively prosperous backgrounds or who had worked their way up through the guild system. Guild membership was even more important for butchers than for bakers, if that's possible. Butcher guilds were powerful organizations that controlled access to the trade, set quality standards, negotiated with city authorities over regulations and fees, and generally protected members from competition and external interference. They could be remarkably aggressive in defending their interests. Butchers who operated outside guild control faced harassment, violence, or legal action. The guild's power came from the collective importance of butchers to urban food supply, and from their ability to organize effectively to pursue their interests. The social perception of butchers reflected medieval society's complicated attitudes toward necessary but unclean work. Wealthy butchers might own substantial property and have financial resources that exceeded many people of technically higher social status, but they couldn't entirely escape the stigma attached to their profession. Some cities prohibited butchers from holding certain public offices or restricted where they could live. Marriage between butcher families and families in more prestigious trades could be problematic. The profession offered economic opportunity but came with social costs that wealth couldn't entirely offset. Different regions developed different specializations within the meat trade. Some butchers focused on cattle, others on pigs or sheep. Poultry required different skills and was sometimes handled by separate traders. Luxury meats like game birds or venison might be sold through different channels entirely. The most successful butchers diversified their offerings, selling multiple types of meat and potentially other products like leather, tallow, or bone that came from butchered animals. The quality control issues around meat were even more serious than those around bread because spoiled meat could kill people much faster than bad bread. Medieval people didn't fully understand bacterial contamination, but they knew that meat that smelled wrong or looked bad was dangerous. Butchers had to move their inventory quickly, especially in warm weather, and had to be scrupulous about not selling spoiled product. Cities regulated meat sales heavily, with inspectors checking quality and authorities punishing butchers who sold tainted meat. The penalties could be severe: fines, loss of guild membership, public punishment, and in extreme cases where people died from bad meat, criminal prosecution. Both bakers and butchers, despite their different products and the different social perceptions of their trades, shared certain characteristics. Both provided essentials that people needed regularly, creating steady demand and relatively stable businesses. Both required significant capital to enter the profession, limiting access and creating a relatively prosperous professional class. Both operated under heavy regulation because the products they sold were too important to be left entirely to market forces, and both could achieve real wealth and security if they managed their businesses competently and maintained good reputations in their communities. Masters of fire and metal, blacksmiths and armourers. If there was one profession that appeared in virtually every medieval settlement regardless of size or location, it was blacksmithing. You could find villages without millers if they were too small to justify a mill. You might find communities without weavers if they produced no cloth. But you would be hard-pressed to find any settlement that didn't have a blacksmith or at least access to one nearby. The reason was simple. Metal was essential to medieval life in ways that are hard to overstate, and blacksmiths were the people who transformed raw metal into the countless useful objects that civilization required. The blacksmith's forge was far more than just a workshop where metal got shaped. It served as a community gathering place, a source of heat on cold days, a spot where news was exchanged and gossip spread, and generally a social hub that rivaled the church or marketplace. People had reasons to visit the forge regularly. Horses needed shoeing, tools needed repairing, metal objects needed fabricating, and while they waited for their work to be done, they talked. The blacksmith heard everything, knew everyone's business, and occupied a unique position in the community's information network. The work itself combined physical labor with genuine technical skill in ways that made it simultaneously accessible and demanding. The basic concept of blacksmithing is straightforward. Heat metal until it's soft enough to shape, then hammer it into whatever form you need. Simple enough in theory. In practice, it required understanding different types of metal and how they responded to heat, developing the hand-eye coordination to strike accurately hundreds of times in succession, learning how to judge temperature by color since thermometers weren't exactly standard blacksmith equipment, and mastering the countless specific techniques needed to create different types of objects. The physical demands were substantial. Swinging a hammer all day built arm and shoulder strength that was impressive even by medieval standards, where most people did manual labor. But it wasn't just strength, it was endurance. A blacksmith might strike the metal hundreds or thousands of times during a single day, each blow requiring force and precision. The heat from the forge was intense, creating working conditions that were sweltering in summer and merely tolerable in winter. The noise was constant. The ring of hammer on metal, the whoosh of bellows feeding air to the fire, the hiss of hot metal meeting water during quenching. After years of this work, many blacksmiths had hearing damage from the constant noise exposure. The range of objects blacksmiths created was staggering. Horseshoes were the obvious product that everyone needed in a society dependent on horses for transportation and agriculture. But that was just the beginning. Nails of various sizes for construction, hinges and latches for doors and chests, chains for various purposes, pots and pans for cooking, tools for other craftspeople, axes, saws, chisels, knives, needles, awls, the list goes on endlessly. Agricultural implements like ploughshares, scythes and sickles, decorative items like iron gates, grills and ornamental fixtures. Anything made of metal potentially came from a blacksmith's forge. The specialization within blacksmithing created a hierarchy of expertise and status. At the base level were blacksmiths who made everyday items, horseshoes, nails, basic tools. This was essential work that required real skill, but it wasn't glamorous and didn't command premium prices. Moving up the ladder, you had smiths who could create more complex items requiring greater precision and artistry. Decorative ironwork for churches or wealthy homes required not just technical skill, but genuine artistic ability. Creating complex mechanisms like locks required understanding how different metal components would interact. These specialized smiths could charge significantly more and enjoyed higher status within the profession. The mystique surrounding blacksmithing had deep roots in human culture. The transformation of raw ore into useful metal seemed almost magical, especially to people without scientific understanding of chemistry and metallurgy. Blacksmiths worked with fire, itself a mysterious and somewhat terrifying element, to somehow change the fundamental nature of materials. In various cultures and time periods, smiths were associated with magic, divine power, or secret knowledge. Norse mythology featured smith gods. Various cultures had legends about smiths with supernatural abilities, and even in Christian medieval Europe, there was a persistent sense that blacksmithing involved knowledge beyond ordinary understanding. This mythological association wasn't entirely divorced from reality. Blacksmiths did possess knowledge that most people lacked, understanding which metals could be used for what purposes, how to work different materials, what techniques produce superior results, how to identify quality metal versus inferior material. This was technical knowledge acquired through years of training and experience, passed down from masters to apprentices, refined through countless hours of practice. In a society where most people were illiterate and technical education was limited, this specialized knowledge set blacksmiths apart and contributed to their somewhat mysterious reputation. The apprenticeship system in blacksmithing was lengthy and demanding. A young person, typically a boy, though there were occasional female blacksmiths, would begin as an apprentice around age 12 or 14 and spend several years learning the trade. The early years involved mostly manual labor, working the bellows to keep the fire hot, hauling coal and metal, cleaning up the workshop, and generally doing whatever the master commanded. As the apprentice demonstrated reliability and developed basic skills, they'd gradually be allowed to do more actual smithing work under close supervision. After several years, they'd become journeymen, skilled workers who could do the work competently, but hadn't yet achieved master status. Becoming a master blacksmith required demonstrating advanced skills, often through creating a masterpiece, a piece of work that showcased the candidate's technical ability and creativity. This might be an elaborate lock, a decorative gate, a complex tool, or any other item that proved the maker's mastery of the craft. The existing masters in the guild would judge the piece, and their approval or rejection determined whether the candidate could establish themselves as an independent master or remained a journeyman working for others. This gatekeeping function helped maintain quality standards while also limiting competition for established masters. The tools of blacksmithing were relatively simple but absolutely essential. The forge itself, a specially designed hearth where fuel burned hot enough to soften metal, bellows to force air into the fire and increase temperature, an anvil, the heavy metal surface on which hot metal was shaped, hammers of various sizes and weights for different purposes, tongs to hold hot metal safely, punches and chisels for creating holes or cutting metal, files and grindstones for finishing work, a quenching tank of water or oil for cooling and hardening metal. Beyond these basics, individual blacksmiths might have dozens of specialized tools they'd acquired or made over years of work. The business model of blacksmithing varied depending on location and circumstances. Rural blacksmiths typically worked on commission, creating items as customers ordered them or repairing things as needed. They might also produce common items like nails or horseshoes in advance to have inventory available for quick sales. urban blacksmiths often specialized more, focusing on particular types of products and selling through established channels. Some blacksmiths worked for larger operations like castles or monasteries, receiving steady pay in exchange for providing smithing services as needed. The economic position of blacksmiths was generally solid, if not spectacular. The work was in constant demand, metal was valuable, and skilled smiths could command decent prices for their services. Blacksmiths typically ranked in the middle tiers of medieval society, above unskilled labourers and poor craftspeople, below merchants and the most prestigious guild masters, but generally secure and respected. A competent blacksmith could support a family comfortably, own their workshop and tools, and enjoy a standard of living that many people envied. Now let's move to the elite of the metalworking profession, armourers and weaponsmiths. These were the specialists who created the equipment that knights and soldiers depended on, literally trusting their lives to the quality of the armour and weapons these craftspeople produced. This was blacksmithing at its most technically demanding and most highly compensated, requiring skills far beyond those needed to make horseshoes or hinges. Creating armour was extraordinarily complex work that combined metallurgical knowledge, mechanical understanding, and artistic skill. A suit of plate armour consisted of dozens of individual pieces that had to fit together precisely, allow for body movement while protecting vital areas, distribute weight bearably across the body, and withstand the impact of weapons. Getting all of this right required understanding human anatomy, biomechanics, the properties of different types of steel, and the techniques for shaping metal into curved forms that matched body contours. The process began with careful measurement, and often involved creating patterns or templates customized to the specific customer. Wealthy knights wanted armour fitted precisely to their bodies, maximizing protection and mobility while minimizing weight. The armourer would then create individual plates, heating and hammering steel into the required shapes. Complex pieces like gauntlets or knee protection required articulated construction with multiple plates connected by rivets or leather hinges, allowing for necessary movement while maintaining protection. The edges had to be smooth to avoid snagging or causing injury to the wearer. The weight had to be distributed so the armour was bearable during long periods of wear. The quality of weapons was literally life or death for their users. A sword that broke in combat, a spear point that bent on impact, a dagger blade that chipped. Any of these failures could get the owner killed. Weaponsmiths couldn't afford to produce inferior products, both because their reputation depended on quality, and because nobles who bought expensive weapons that failed tended to be rather upset about it. Creating superior weapons required mastering techniques like forge welding to create layered steel with different properties, proper hardening and tempering to achieve the right balance of hardness and flexibility, and precision grinding to create edges that held their sharpness while resisting damage. The materials themselves were expensive and often difficult to obtain. High-quality steel suitable for armour and weapons commanded premium prices and wasn't always available. Armourers and weaponsmiths needed suppliers they could trust to provide consistent quality metal. They might need to test materials, possibly rejecting batches that didn't meet their standards. The material costs alone meant that armour and weapons were luxury goods accessible only to the wealthy. A full suit of plate armour could cost as much as a village, putting it beyond the means of anyone except nobility and the wealthiest merchants. The social status of master armourers and weaponsmiths reflected the value and importance of their work. These weren't just craftspeople, they were artists and engineers whose creations represented the cutting edge of medieval technology. The best armourers enjoyed royal patronage, received commissions from the wealthiest nobles, and could live in considerable comfort. They might dress well, own property, associate with people well above their technical social station, and generally enjoy prestige that most craftspeople couldn't approach. The workshop of a master armourer was a complex operation employing multiple assistants and apprentices. Creating armour required so much specialised work that no single person could do it all efficiently. Some workers might specialise in particular pieces or techniques, others might handle finishing and polishing, still others might manage the business side of operations. The most famous armourers operated what were essentially small factories, producing multiple complete suits of armour simultaneously, while maintaining the quality control that their reputation depended on. The relationship between armourers and their clients was often long-term and surprisingly personal. A knight who found an armourer whose work fit well and held up in combat would return repeatedly, establishing a relationship that might last decades. The armourer would become familiar with that knight's body proportions, preferences, and requirements. They might repair and upgrade armour over time, creating a continuous working relationship that benefited both parties. Trust was essential. The knight was literally trusting his life to the armourer's skill, and the armourer was trusting the knight to pay for expensive custom work. The technical innovations in armour and weapons during the medieval period reflected the armourer's creativity and expertise. The transition from mail to plate armour, the development of articulated joints, improvements in helmet design, advances in sword construction, all of these came from armourers and weaponsmiths experimenting with new techniques and designs. These craftspeople weren't just following established patterns, they were pushing the boundaries of what was possible with the materials and techniques available, creating genuine technological progress through their work. The guild structures for armourers and weaponsmiths were necessarily different from those for ordinary blacksmiths. The specialised knowledge required, the high-value products created, and the relatively small number of practitioners meant these guilds operated more like exclusive clubs than like the large craft guilds typical of other trades. Membership was restricted, training was rigorous, and standards were high. This exclusivity protected the economic interests of existing masters while maintaining the quality reputation that justified the premium prices they charged. What's striking about both ordinary blacksmiths and their more specialised cousins in armour and weapon making is how central they were to medieval civilization while remaining fundamentally craftspeople. The blacksmith shoeing horses enabled transportation and agriculture. The armourer creating plate armour enabled the military system that defined medieval warfare. Both took raw materials and transformed them into useful objects through skill and knowledge acquired over years of training. Both commanded respect and reasonable prosperity in their communities. And both represented the best of what medieval craftsmanship could achieve, taking simple tools and raw materials and creating products that were functional, durable, and sometimes genuinely beautiful. That combination of utility and artistry, of physical labour and technical knowledge, defined medieval metalworking at its best. Let's discuss one of the more unsettling career combinations in medieval history, the barber surgeon. In a world where trained physicians were rare and expensive enough that most people would never encounter one, the local barber handled not just haircuts, but also a remarkable range of medical procedures that would make modern healthcare regulators need immediate sedation. We're talking about someone who might trim your beard in the morning and perform surgery on your neighbour that afternoon, using more or less the same workspace, and probably not sterilising anything in between because germ theory wouldn't be. Discovered for several more centuries. The iconic barber pole, those red and white stripes that still identify barbershops today, had a significantly more gruesome origin than most people realise. The red represented blood, and the white represented the bandages used in medical procedures. Some versions included blue to represent veins. So that cheerful spiral pattern you see outside modern barbershops is basically a medieval advertisement saying, yes, we'll cut your hair, but we can also drain your blood if you're feeling a bit too sanguine about life. Not exactly the comforting imagery you want from your healthcare provider, but medieval people had different expectations. Bloodletting was perhaps the most common medical procedure barber surgeons performed, which tells you something about medieval medical theory that isn't particularly flattering. The prevailing belief, inherited from ancient Greek medicine and particularly the physician Galen, held that disease resulted from imbalances in the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much of any humour caused illness, and the solution was to remove the excess. Since blood was the easiest humour to access and remove, bloodletting became the go-to treatment for an astonishing range of conditions. Fever, bloodletting, infection. Bloodletting. Headache, probably bloodletting. The treatment was essentially, when in doubt, drain some blood and see if that helps. The actual procedure involved making an incision in a vein, usually in the arm, and allowing blood to flow out into a bowl until the practitioner decided enough had been removed. The amount varied depending on the patient's condition, the physician's orders if one was involved, or the barber surgeon's judgment if they were working independently. Some patients were bled until they fainted, which was actually considered a good sign. It meant you'd removed enough blood to rebalance the humours. The fact that making people faint from blood loss is generally bad for their health apparently didn't factor heavily into medical thinking at the time. The tools were straightforward: lancets for making incisions, bowls for collecting blood, and bandages for afterward. The technique required some skill to avoid cutting too deeply or hitting the wrong vessel, but it wasn't technically complex. The real skill was in knowing when to stop, though given that the entire theoretical basis was wrong, even expert judgment was essentially guessing. Some patients probably benefited from bloodletting through a placebo effect, or because reducing blood volume temporarily lowered blood pressure in hypertensive individuals. But many others were actively harmed by losing blood they needed, becoming weaker and more vulnerable to the conditions they were supposedly being treated for. Tooth extraction was another major service barber surgeons provided, and it was about as pleasant as it sounds. Dental care in the medieval period was rudimentary at best. People understood that rotting teeth caused pain and needed to be removed, but the tools and techniques were primitive. The barber surgeon would grip the offending tooth with pliers or forceps and pull, hopefully extracting the entire tooth including the roots. Sometimes it worked smoothly, other times the tooth broke, requiring multiple attempts to remove fragments. Sometimes the forceps slipped and damaged adjacent teeth or soft tissue. The patient was conscious through all of this, gripping the chair arms and trying not to scream too loudly. No anesthesia beyond maybe some alcohol to dull the pain, no antibiotics to prevent infection afterward, just the hope that the extraction would heal properly and the pain would eventually subside. The infections that sometimes followed tooth extractions could be serious or even fatal. Facial infections from dental problems could spread to the jaw, the sinuses, the throat, or even the brain. Without antibiotics, the body either fought off the infection successfully or didn't, and there wasn't much anyone could do beyond hope and prayer. The barber surgeon who performed the extraction might try poultices or other remedies, but these were largely ineffective against serious bacterial infections. So getting a tooth pulled was always a calculated risk. Continuing pain and potential complications from the bad tooth versus immediate pain and potential complications from the extraction. Surgery, when barber surgeons performed it, was limited to relatively straightforward procedures. Setting broken bones, treating wounds, amputating damaged limbs, removing growths or tumours accessible from the outside, dealing with battlefield injuries. These were the kinds of surgical interventions that fell within the barber surgeon's scope. Anything involving internal organs or complex procedures was beyond their capabilities, partly because the knowledge didn't exist, and partly because patients rarely survive such interventions anyway. The lack of anesthesia and antiseptic technique meant that surgery was a last resort, attempted only when the alternative was certain death or disability. The speed of surgical procedures was actually considered a virtue, because it minimized the patient's suffering and shock. A skilled surgeon could amputate a limb in just a few minutes, cutting through flesh and bone while assistants held the patient down. The faster it was done, the less time the patient spent in agony and the less blood they lost. Of course, speed also increased the risk of mistakes, cutting the wrong tissue, leaving bone fragments, damaging blood vessels, but the trade-off seemed worth it. Post-surgical survival depended largely on whether infection developed, which it did frequently enough that surgery remained a desperate measure, even when technically feasible. The social position of barber surgeons was deeply ambiguous. On one hand, they provided services that people genuinely needed and sometimes saved lives or at least alleviated suffering. A barber surgeon who could set bones properly, treat wounds effectively, or extract teeth without causing excessive damage was valued in the community. On the other hand, the work was bloody, involved intimate contact with diseased bodies, and required causing pain to patients. The combination of hair care and medical procedures struck some people as inappropriate, a mixing of the mundane and the serious that diminished both. The distinction between barber surgeons and university-trained physicians was important in medieval medical hierarchy. Physicians had formal education, studied medical texts, understood theory, and prescribed treatments. They were learned men who diagnosed conditions and determined appropriate remedies. Barber surgeons were craftsmen who did the actual manual work, the cutting, the bleeding, the extracting. Physicians generally considered themselves far superior and looked down on barber surgeons as mere technicians. But in practice, most people encountered only barber surgeons because physicians were expensive, lived in cities, and served primarily wealthy clients. The training for barber surgeons followed the standard apprenticeship model. A young person would apprentice to an established barber surgeon, learning the trade through observation and gradually taking on more responsibilities as they developed skill. There was some theoretical knowledge to absorb, basic anatomy, the humour theory, common ailments and treatments, but most of the learning was practical. how to hold the lancet for bloodletting, how to grip the tooth for extraction, how to clean and dress wounds, how to handle patients who are frightened or in pain. After several years, the apprentice would become a journeyman and eventually might establish their own practice if they could afford the setup costs and gain guild membership. The workspace where barber surgeons practiced was often surprisingly casual by modern standards. The same chair used for haircuts might be used for bloodletting or tooth extraction. Tools were cleaned between patients, but the standards of cleanliness were limited by not understanding disease transmission. The barber surgeon's shop was a public space where people could watch procedures being performed, which probably helped spread information about who was skilled and who wasn't, but also meant medical procedures lacked any privacy. Imagine getting a tooth pulled while curious neighbours watched from the doorway, discussing your misfortune and the practitioner's technique. The red and white pole actually had a functional origin beyond just symbolism. During bloodletting, patients would grip a pole or staff to make their veins more prominent. After the procedure, the bloodied bandages would be wrapped around the pole and hung outside to dry, creating the red and white spiral pattern that eventually became standardized into the barber pole design. So that decorative element started as literally displaying your used medical supplies to the public, which is perhaps not the origin story the barbershop industry particularly likes to emphasize these days. Now let's turn to apothecaries, who occupied a somewhat more respectable position in the medieval medical hierarchy, despite also working with their hands. Apothecaries prepared medicines, compounded prescriptions, and sold remedies to people seeking relief from various ailments. Their shops were fascinating spaces filled with jars, bottles, boxes, and containers holding an extraordinary range of substances, from common local herbs to exotic ingredients imported from halfway across the known world. The knowledge required to be a successful apothecary was substantial. You needed to understand botany well enough to identify plants correctly, crucial when the difference between similar-looking herbs might be the difference between healing and poisoning. You needed to know which parts of plants were medicinal and how to prepare them: roots, leaves, flowers, seeds, or bark, dried or fresh, whole or powdered. You needed to understand dosages, because many effective medicines were toxic in large amounts. You needed to know how to compound different ingredients into pills, powders, syrups, ointments, or other forms that patients could actually use. The range of ingredients apothecaries worked with was genuinely impressive. Local herbs formed the foundation, things like chamomile, mint, sage, rosemary, thyme, and dozens of others that could be gathered locally or grown in gardens. But apothecaries also stocked more exotic materials that came through trade networks spanning continents. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, ginger, and cloves that came from Asia. Opium and various resins from the Mediterranean. Minerals and metals like mercury, sulfur, and antimony. Animal products like musk, ambergris, and various organs or secretions believed to have medicinal properties. The global reach of medieval trade networks meant that an apothecary in London or Paris might be working with ingredients from India, Arabia, Africa, and beyond. Some of these ingredients were genuinely effective for their intended purposes. Opium actually did relieve pain, though it came with addiction risks that weren't fully appreciated. Willow bark contained compounds similar to modern aspirin and reduced fever and pain. Various herbs had real pharmacological effects that traditional medicine had identified through trial and error over centuries. Other ingredients were useless or actively harmful, based on medical theories that didn't correspond to reality. Mercury compounds were prescribed for various conditions despite being toxic. Bizarre animal products were used based on sympathetic magic thinking, rather than any actual therapeutic value. The atmosphere in an apothecary's shop must have been remarkable. The scent alone would be overwhelming, a mixture of spices, herbs, oils, and various substances that created an olfactory experience unlike anywhere else in the medieval city. The visual impact was equally striking, with rows of ceramic jars and wooden boxes, each labelled with its contents in Latin that most customers couldn't read. Glass bottles and flasks reflected light in mysterious ways. The overall effect was designed to impress customers with the apothecary's learning and expertise, creating an environment where the preparation of medicines seemed like a form of sophisticated knowledge bordering on alchemy. Many apothecaries did engage with alchemical ideas, which in the medieval context wasn't the same as the silly turn lead into gold stereotype suggests. Alchemy was an early form of chemistry, focused on understanding how substances transformed and could be manipulated. Alchemical techniques like distillation, sublimation, and various extraction methods were genuinely useful for preparing medicines. The theoretical framework might have been wrong. No, you couldn't create a universal medicine that cured all diseases, but the practical techniques were often sound. An apothecary who understood alchemical processes could create more refined and effective preparations than someone just grinding herbs and mixing them with wine. The relationship between apothecaries, barber surgeons, and physicians was complex and sometimes contentious. Ideally, physicians diagnosed conditions and wrote prescriptions, apothecaries prepared the medicines according to those prescriptions, and barber surgeons performed physical interventions. In practice, boundaries were blurry. Apothecaries often advised customers on remedies without physician involvement, effectively diagnosing and treating based on their own knowledge. Barber surgeons sometimes prepared simple medicines. Physicians complained about both groups encroaching on medical practice, while apothecaries and barber surgeons resented being treated as mere servants to physicians. Guilds and city regulations tried to maintain distinctions, but enforcement was inconsistent. The cost of medicines from apothecaries varied wildly depending on ingredients. Simple herbal remedies might be affordable for ordinary people, though still representing a significant expense for those living on thin margins. Compounds involving expensive imported ingredients or complex preparation could cost amounts that only wealthy individuals could afford. This created a two-tier medical system where the poor made do with folk remedies and cheap medicines, while the rich could access the full range of apothecary preparations, regardless of whether the expensive medicines were actually more effective than the cheap ones. The apothecary's business required significant capital to establish. You needed premises suitable for preparing and storing medicines, which meant secure space that was relatively clean and dry. You needed the actual inventory of ingredients, which for a well-stocked shop meant considerable investment in purchasing materials from various suppliers. You needed tools and equipment for preparing medicines, mortars and pestles, scales for measuring, vessels for heating and mixing, storage containers. You needed knowledge, which meant either lengthy apprenticeship or some form of formal education. All of this meant that becoming an apothecary required either substantial family wealth, generous backing, or working your way up through the guild system. Guild regulation of apothecaries varied by location, but generally aimed to maintain quality standards and protect practitioners from competition. The guilds set standards for what ingredients could be used, how medicines should be prepared, what prices could be charged. They controlled who could practice the trade through apprenticeship requirements and master status. They inspected shops to ensure members weren't adulterating expensive ingredients with cheaper substitutes or selling spoiled materials. The collective power of the guild protected individual apothecaries from pressure by physicians or city authorities, while maintaining public confidence in the medicines being sold. The knowledge apothecaries possessed extended beyond just medicine preparation. They understood preservation techniques, how to prevent ingredients from spoiling or losing potency. They knew commercial sources for various materials and the relative quality of supplies from different suppliers. They understood the economics of the medicine trade, which ingredients were becoming scarce and expensive, which were plentiful, how to substitute when necessary. This commercial knowledge made some apothecaries wealthy, particularly those who could secure reliable sources of expensive ingredients and serve wealthy clientele. The ethical issues in the apothecary trade were significant. How do you charge for medicines when customers are desperate and may not be able to afford what they need? Do you adulterate expensive ingredients to make them more affordable, knowing the medicine will be less effective? Do you sell treatments you suspect are useless because customers expect them and stopping would hurt your business? Do you prepare medicines prescribed by physicians when you believe the prescription is wrong or potentially harmful? These weren't academic questions. They were practical dilemmas that apothecaries faced regularly and that different practitioners answered differently. The literacy and education levels of apothecaries were generally higher than most craftspeople. You needed to read Latin to understand medical texts and work with the standardized ingredient names. You needed basic mathematics to calculate dosages and manage business accounts. You needed writing skills to keep records and correspond with suppliers. This educational requirement meant apothecaries came from and existed in a somewhat elevated social sphere, associated with learned professionals even though they worked with their hands. An educated apothecary might socialize with lawyers, merchants, and minor officials, people who would be unlikely to associate closely with most craftspeople. Keepers of knowledge, scribes, and book copyists. Before the printing press revolutionized book production in the 15th century, every single book had to be created by hand, one page at a time, by scribes who spent hours, days, weeks, or even months copying texts. This wasn't just writing things down, it was skilled labor requiring precision, knowledge, artistic ability, and patience that most people simply didn't possess. The result was that books were rare, expensive, and treated as valuable objects that might represent months of a scribe's working life. The physical process of creating a manuscript was labor-intensive from start to finish. First, someone had to prepare the writing surface, which was usually parchment made from animal skins. The parchment had to be carefully prepared, scraped, treated, and cut to size. Then it needed to be ruled with lines to guide the scribe's writing, ensuring the text would be straight and evenly spaced. The scribe would then begin copying, working from an exemplar text while creating the new manuscript. Each letter had to be formed carefully, each word spelled correctly, each line properly spaced. A full book might require weeks or months of this meticulous work. The calligraphic skill required was substantial. Medieval handwriting styles like Gothic or Caroline minuscule weren't simple printing. They required precise pen control to create letter forms that were consistent, legible, and aesthetically pleasing. The letters needed to be uniform in size, spacing needed to be even, the ink colour needed to be consistent throughout. A scribe who couldn't maintain quality over long copying sessions would produce manuscripts that were difficult to read or that looked unprofessional. The best scribes created pages of such consistent beauty that you could barely tell where one day's work ended and the next began. The working conditions were physically demanding in ways that aren't immediately obvious. Scribes spent hours hunched over their work, maintaining the bent posture necessary to write on angled desks. This created chronic back and neck pain that probably plagued most experienced scribes. The hand holding the pen would cramp from the constant precise movements. The eyes suffered from the close focus required, especially when working in the dim lighting conditions typical of medieval interiors. Candles or oil lamps provided some illumination, but not nearly enough for comfortable close work. Many scribes probably developed vision problems that eventually forced them out of the profession, or at least reduced their productivity. The mental fatigue was equally significant. Copying text word by word, maintaining focus on accuracy while also ensuring proper formatting and spacing, required constant attention over long periods. A moment's distraction could result in skipped words, repeated passages, or errors that might not be noticed until much later. The repetitive nature of the work was monotonous. You weren't creating original content or making creative decisions. You were faithfully reproducing what someone else had written, potentially centuries earlier. Some scribes found the work meditative, entering a focused state where time passed easily. Others found it tedious, enduring rather than enjoying the hours at the desk. The knowledge required went beyond just being able to write clearly. Scribes needed literacy, which in the medieval context meant Latin for most scholarly, religious or legal texts. You had to understand what you were copying well enough to recognize errors in the exemplar you were working from, or mistakes in your own copying. You needed to understand the abbreviations that were commonly used to save space and time. Medieval texts were full of shortened forms that a modern reader would find baffling, but that scribes had to know and apply consistently. You needed grammatical knowledge to punctuate correctly and to recognize when something didn't make sense. Illuminated manuscripts required additional skills that put them in a category beyond simple copying. Illumination meant adding decorative elements, ornate initial letters, border decorations, miniature paintings illustrating the text. Creating these required genuine artistic ability, along with the copying skills. The illuminator, who might be the same person as the scribe or a different specialist, needed to draw and paint with precision, using expensive pigments and gold leaf to create decorations that were beautiful and appropriate to the text. The most elaborate illuminated manuscripts represented hundreds of hours of work and cost amounts that only royalty or the wealthiest institutions could afford. Scribes worked in various settings depending on who employed them and what kinds of texts they copied. Monastic scriptoria were perhaps the most important centres of book production in the early medieval period. These were dedicated spaces within monasteries where monks would work on copying religious texts, creating the liturgical books needed for worship, and preserving classical texts that might otherwise have been lost. The monastic scribes weren't paid wages. Copying was part of their religious duty, a form of prayer and service. But they had security, regular meals, and usually adequate working conditions, which was more than many secular scribes could claim. Urban workshops emerged as book production gradually commercialized, particularly from the 12th century onward. These were businesses run by master scribes who employed journeymen and apprentices, taking commissions from customers who needed books copied. Universities created demand for textbooks, law courts needed legal texts, wealthy individuals wanted luxury books for their libraries, merchants needed account books and records. The range of customers meant urban scribes might work on very different types of projects: academic texts, legal documents, romances and poetry, religious books for private devotion, practical manuals on various subjects. The economics of book production made manuscripts expensive in ways that are hard for modern readers to appreciate fully. The materials alone cost significantly. Parchment required animal skins, usually several skins per book, and good quality parchment wasn't cheap. Ink required preparation from specific ingredients. Gold leaf for illumination was literally gold. Then you had the labour cost, which for a substantial book might represent weeks or months of skilled work. The final price for a well-made manuscript could equal months or even years of an ordinary worker's wages, putting books out of reach for all but the wealthy and institutions. This high cost meant books were treated as valuable property that might be inherited, used as collateral for loans, or even stolen and sold. University libraries chained valuable books to reading desks to prevent theft. Wealthy individuals might own just a handful of books that represented significant portions of their wealth. The idea that books were disposable or that you might casually lend one to a friend, that wasn't how medieval people thought about book ownership. These were precious objects that you protected and maintained carefully, because replacement was expensive and difficult. The social status of scribes varied considerably, depending on their specific situation and clients. A scribe copying legal documents for wealthy merchants might enjoy comfortable circumstances and respect in the community. A scribe working in a monastery had different status entirely, part of the religious community rather than secular society. A struggling scribe taking whatever copying work they could find might live barely above poverty, their literacy and skill not translating into financial security. Education and skill didn't automatically confer prosperity or status. Those depended on finding clients and work. The opportunity for social advancement that scribal work offered was real but limited. Literacy gave access to educated society and to occupations beyond manual labour. A talented scribe might come from humble origins, but through skill and opportunity move into more prestigious positions, becoming a notary, working for a powerful patron, eventually perhaps entering church service or government administration. The sons of scribes, raised with literacy and education, had opportunities their fathers might not have had. But this upward mobility was far from guaranteed, and many scribes remained in the profession their entire lives without particular distinction or advancement. The anonymity of much scribal work is striking from a modern perspective. Most manuscripts don't identify their scribes. The focus was on the text itself, not the person who copied it. Only occasionally would a scribe add a note at the end of a text, maybe complaining about how hard the work was or asking for prayers, but even then often without giving their name. The thousands of hours spent copying text that would be read by others for centuries, the skill and care invested in creating beautiful manuscripts, all of this was usually uncredited, with the scribe's contribution invisible except to experts who could identify hands and styles. The errors that inevitably crept into copied texts created interesting problems and opportunities. Every time a text was copied, there was potential for mistakes, skipped words, repeated passages, misread letters, copyist editorializing. When this copied text was then used as an exemplar for another copy, the errors propagated and new ones were added. Over multiple generations of copying, texts could become quite corrupted, diverging from the original in ways that sometimes created confusion or scholarly disputes. Scribes who were careful and knowledgeable tried to correct obvious errors, comparing multiple exemplars when possible, but this also meant introducing their own judgments about what the text should say. The personal toll of a lifetime spent copying is suggested by occasional marginal notes scribes left in manuscripts. Complaints about cold fingers, poor light, aching backs, difficult exemplars, or just general exhaustion appear scattered through medieval manuscripts. These brief glimpses into the scribe's experience remind us that real human beings sat for hours creating each book, dealing with physical discomfort and mental fatigue while producing work that required consistent quality. The fact that they mostly succeeded, producing manuscripts that remain legible and sometimes beautiful centuries later, speaks to their skill and dedication. The decline of manuscript production came relatively quickly after the printing press proved viable. Within decades of Gutenberg's innovations, printed books were competing with manuscripts for most purposes. Printed books were cheaper, produced faster, and identical copies ensured consistency. The scribal profession didn't disappear overnight. There remained demand for luxury manuscripts, for certain types of documents that needed handwriting, for specialized work. But the mass market for copied books largely evaporated, and with it the livelihood of many scribes. It was technological disruption, on a scale that would be familiar to workers in many modern industries, watching their professions become obsolete. What united scribes and manuscript producers across their various settings and specializations was their role as keepers and transmitters of knowledge. Whether copying religious texts, classical philosophy, legal codes, or romances, they were preserving and spreading information in a society where illiteracy was the norm. The texts they copied connected medieval Europe to classical antiquity, preserved religious traditions, enabled legal and administrative systems, and allowed ideas to spread beyond their origins. Without this army of scribes labouring in monasteries, workshops, and courts across Europe, the intellectual life of the medieval period would have been impossibly limited. They were the information technology specialists of their age, and their work literally preserved civilization's knowledge through centuries when it might otherwise have been lost. While most medieval professions left little physical trace beyond mentions in dusty records, stonemasons created monuments that have outlasted empires. The cathedrals, castles, bridges, and city walls they built are still standing centuries later, which is more than can be said for most modern construction that starts falling apart after a few decades. These weren't people who built for quarterly earnings reports or short-term profit margins. They were creating structures intended to last forever, and in many cases they actually succeeded. Not a bad legacy for people working with hand tools and without any of the engineering software that modern construction absolutely depends on. The term stonemason covers a wide range of specializations and skill levels, from rough masons who cut and shaped basic building blocks to master masons who designed complex architectural features and oversaw major projects. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the quarrymen who extracted stone from the earth, doing the brutal physical work of cutting massive blocks from quarry faces. Above them were the rough masons who dressed stone into basic rectangular shapes suitable for walls. Then came the freestone masons who worked with finer stone that could be carved, creating decorative elements, sculptures, and architectural details. At the top were the master masons who combined technical knowledge, artistic vision, and organizational skills to design and manage major building projects. The skills required were genuinely impressive and took years to acquire through hands-on training. A stonemason needed to understand different types of stone, which were suitable for foundations versus decorative work, which would withstand weather, which could be carved with detail, which were structurally sound for bearing weight. Limestone, sandstone, granite, marble, each had different properties that affected how it could be worked and where it should be used. Choosing the wrong stone for a particular application could result in structural failure or decorative elements that weathered away within years instead of lasting centuries. The geometry knowledge required was substantial, especially for master masons designing complex structures. Gothic cathedrals with their pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses weren't built by people just winging it and hoping for the best. These were carefully calculated structures where forces needed to be channeled correctly, or the whole thing would collapse, probably killing a bunch of workers and definitely embarrassing everyone involved. Master masons understood practical geometry and engineering principles that let them calculate load distribution, determine proper arch curves, and design vaulting systems that would remain stable. Much of this knowledge was passed down through guild traditions and practical experience rather than written in textbooks, but it was sophisticated nonetheless. The actual work of stone construction was physically demanding in ways that would horrify modern occupational safety advocates. Masons worked at heights that would make your average insurance adjuster faint, standing on wooden scaffolding that was essentially a collection of poles lashed together with rope. No safety harnesses, no guardrails, no hard hats, just you and your tools and a long drop to the ground if you lost your balance. Falls from scaffolding were common enough that they were considered an occupational hazard rather than a preventable tragedy. Some masons survived falls with broken bones that might heal badly, leaving them unable to work. Others didn't survive at all, becoming statistics that nobody bothered recording systematically. The stones themselves were dangerous. These weren't lightweight materials you could toss around casually. We're talking about blocks weighing hundreds or thousands of pounds. Moving them required systems of ropes, pulleys, and manual labour that could go wrong in spectacular fashion. A rope breaking could send a stone plummeting, crushing anyone below. A pulley failing could cause a load to swing wildly. Even just working with hand tools on stone created hazards. A chisel slipping could impale your hand, a hammer miss could crush fingers, flying stone chips could damage eyes. Medieval construction sites were genuinely dangerous places where serious injuries occurred regularly. The stone dust was perhaps the most insidious hazard because it caused damage slowly over years rather than in a single accident. Masons spent their working lives creating clouds of fine stone particles every time they cut, carved, or dressed stone. They breathed this dust constantly, and over time it accumulated in their lungs, causing what we'd now recognize as silicosis, a progressive and ultimately fatal lung disease. Medieval people noticed that older masons often developed breathing problems, chronic coughing, and general weakness, but they didn't understand the connection to stone dust exposure. They just accepted it as part of the profession, the price you paid for working with stone. Many experienced masons died relatively young from respiratory failure, their expertise lost because they literally couldn't breathe well enough to continue working. The seasonal nature of stone construction created an annual rhythm that structured masons' lives. Building season ran roughly from spring to autumn, when weather permitted outdoor work and mortar would cure properly. Winter was the enemy. Frost could crack wet mortar, snow made scaffolding treacherous, and cold temperatures made stone brittle and difficult to work. So major projects essentially shut down for several months each year, sending masons into unemployment unless they had other skills they could use during the off-season. Some carved details indoors in heated workshops, others found maintenance work. Many simply endured the lean winter months and hoped their summer earnings would carry them through. This seasonal pattern meant that annual income was compressed into about 8 or 9 months of actual work, which had to cover 12 months of living expenses. Smart masons saved money during building season to survive the winter. Others lived hand to mouth, prosperous in summer and struggling in winter. The uncertainty must have been stressful. Would next year bring good work? Would the weather cooperate? Would you stay healthy and avoid injury? These weren't abstract concerns, but real questions that determined whether you and your family would eat regularly. The tools masons used were relatively simple, but required considerable skill to use effectively. The basic toolkit included hammers and chisels of various sizes for shaping stone, squares and levels for ensuring accuracy, compasses and dividers for geometric work, and saws for certain types of cutting. More specialized tools existed for particular tasks: point chisels for rough work, tooth chisels for smoothing, flat chisels for finishing, bow saws for curved cuts. Master masons might have dozens of specialized tools accumulated over years of work, each suited to particular types of stone or specific tasks. The actual techniques for working stone required both strength and precision. Rough shaping might involve striking the stone with heavy hammers to break off large pieces, relying more on force than finesse. Fine carving demanded careful, controlled strikes that removed small amounts of stone precisely, gradually revealing the intended form. A skilled mason could look at a block of stone and see the finished piece inside, then methodically remove everything that wasn't part of that vision. This wasn't just manual labour, it was a craft that combined physical capability with artistic vision and technical knowledge. The training system followed the standard medieval pattern of apprenticeship, journeyman, and master levels, but the timeline was particularly long for masonry, given the complexity of skills to be learned. An apprenticeship might last 7 years or more, with the young apprentice starting on basic tasks like carrying tools, mixing mortar, and cleaning the work area. As they demonstrated capability, they'd gradually be allowed to do more actual stonework under supervision. First rough shaping, then more precise cutting, eventually decorative carving if they showed artistic talent. The learning was largely through observation and practice, with the master mason demonstrating techniques that the apprentice would then attempt to replicate. After completing apprenticeship, a mason became a journeyman, literally a person who could journey from job to job, selling their labour to whoever needed skilled workers. Journeyman masons often travelled extensively, working on various projects and continuing to develop their skills. This travel was actually important for professional development, as it exposed masons to different architectural styles, building techniques, and regional variations in how stone was worked. A journeyman who had worked on projects in multiple regions would have broader experience and knowledge than one who'd remained in a single location. Achieving master mason status required demonstrating advanced skills and creating a masterpiece that showed technical excellence and artistic merit. This might be an elaborate carving, a complex architectural element, or drawings for a significant structure. The existing masters in the guild would evaluate the work, and their approval or rejection determined whether the journeyman could establish themselves as a master. For those who made it to master level, the opportunities expanded significantly. Master masons could take on apprentices, bid for major projects, design buildings, and generally operate at the highest level of the profession. The really successful master masons became something like travelling consultants, moving from one major project to another across regions or even countries. A master mason with a reputation for expertise in cathedral construction might be called to multiple cities as their skills were needed. They'd arrive, survey the site, provide designs and technical direction, train local workers, oversee the initial construction phases, then move on to the next project while leaving qualified subordinates to continue the work. This mobility meant the most talented masons weren't tied to any single location, but went where the work and the money were best. The compensation for skilled masons was generally good, at least during building season. Master masons working on major projects could earn wages that put them well above ordinary labourers and even above many other skilled craftspeople. The irregularity of the income due to seasonal shutdowns and the time between projects meant that overall annual income was more variable than for professions with steadier work, but in a good year, a successful mason could accumulate real wealth. Some invested in property, others in training additional apprentices, still others simply saved against lean times. The relationship between masons and their patrons, typically the church, nobility, or wealthy merchants funding construction projects, was complicated by the vast difference in status combined with the patron's dependence on the mason's expertise. A bishop commissioning a cathedral needed the master mason's knowledge to actually build the structure successfully. The patron might have opinions about how it should look, but the mason understood what was structurally possible and how to achieve it. This created a dynamic where the mason had to balance deference to the patron's authority with professional confidence in their own expertise. Contract disputes were common enough that guilds developed standards and arbitration processes. What happened if the patron wanted to reduce costs midway through construction? What if the mason discovered problems with the original design that required expensive modifications? What if weather delays pushed the project past the contracted completion date? These weren't hypothetical questions, but practical issues that arose regularly. The most successful masons were those who could navigate the political and economic aspects of construction projects while also handling the technical challenges. The legacy aspect of stone construction gave the work a meaning beyond just earning wages. A mason working on a cathedral knew they were creating something that would outlast them by centuries, that would be seen and used by countless future generations. Their name might not be recorded for posterity. Most medieval masons remain anonymous despite their extraordinary work, but the physical evidence of their skill would endure. There's something satisfying about that permanence, especially compared to modern work that's often ephemeral or quickly obsolete. Some masons did manage to leave their mark, literally. Masons' marks, personal symbols carved into stones, appear throughout medieval buildings, identifying which mason shaped particular blocks. These weren't signatures exactly, more like quality control marks and proof of work for payment purposes. But they also represented a kind of personal stamp, a way of saying I made this that survived even when names were forgotten. Modern researchers study these marks to understand construction techniques, work organization, and mason mobility across projects. The danger of the work created a certain camaraderie among masons. When you're working alongside someone on a narrow scaffold 40 feet in the air, you develop trust and reliance that goes beyond normal workplace relationships. The shared risks and challenges of construction work bonded masons together in ways that probably contributed to the strong guild traditions in the masonry trades. These were people who understood viscerally that they depended on each other's competence and care for their safety and success. The architectural knowledge that master masons possessed was often closely guarded and passed down within guild traditions. Exactly how to calculate the proportions for a stable arch, how to design a vault that would support its own weight, how to channel forces through a structure. This was valuable proprietary knowledge that gave masons competitive advantage. Some of it was written down in master masons' notebooks, but much remained oral tradition, demonstrated rather than described, learned through hands-on experience under expert guidance. The mystique surrounding master masons partly derived from this secret knowledge that set them apart from those outside the trade. The variety of structures masons built was remarkable. Grand cathedrals get the most attention and admiration, and rightly so. These were architectural masterpieces that pushed the limits of what was possible with stone construction. But masons also built the more mundane infrastructure that kept medieval society functioning. Bridges that would carry traffic for centuries, city walls that protected populations, castle fortifications that had to withstand sieges, houses for the wealthy, monasteries and churches of varying scales, mills and workshops and storage buildings. The entire built environment of stone structures represented mason labour and expertise. Each type of construction had its own challenges and requirements. Bridge building required understanding water dynamics and foundations that could withstand flooding. Fortifications needed to anticipate military tactics and weapons. Churches required acoustic considerations so sound would carry properly. Residential buildings needed to balance structural requirements with livability. A truly skilled mason could adapt their knowledge to different types of projects, though some chose to specialize in particular building types, where they developed particular expertise. The aesthetic dimension of masonry work meant that the best practitioners were genuine artists, not just craftspeople following established patterns. The sculpture work on Gothic cathedrals, those elaborate carvings of saints, demons, biblical scenes, and decorative elements, required not just technical skill in carving stone but artistic vision and creativity. Some mason sculptors created works of real beauty and emotional impact that still move viewers centuries later. These artists worked in stone rather than paint or canvas, but they were every bit as much artists as any painter or poet. The relationship between religious devotion and stone construction was significant, especially for masons working on church projects. For some, building houses of worship was itself a form of devotion, a way of serving God through their craft. Medieval people believed that physical labour offered to God had spiritual value, and creating beautiful churches could be understood as prayer made tangible. Whether individual masons were particularly pious or were mainly motivated by wages, the religious context of much of their work was inescapable and probably influenced how they understood their profession. The guild regulations for masons were particularly complex given the range of skills and specializations involved. Different grades of mason had different privileges and obligations. Requirements for achieving master status varied by location and specialty. Rules governed how work should be done, what standards needed to be met, how disputes should be resolved. The most powerful mason guilds wielded considerable influence over construction in their regions, controlling labour supply and setting standards that both protected workers and ensured quality. The international nature of stone construction meant that architectural ideas and techniques spread across Europe through travelling masons. A mason who worked on Gothic structures in France might carry that knowledge to England or Germany. Regional styles influenced each other as masons moved between projects and locations. The similarity of Gothic architecture across different regions partly reflects this mobility of skilled workers who brought ideas and techniques with them. In this way, masons were agents of cultural transmission, spreading architectural knowledge across linguistic and political boundaries. The monuments these workers left behind are still impressive today, which tells you something about the sophistication of medieval building techniques. Yes, they had some advantages. Labour was cheap, time constraints were loose, and clients were often willing to invest enormous resources in prestige projects. But they also worked without power tools, structural engineering calculations, modern materials, or any of the technical support that construction today takes for granted. The fact that medieval cathedrals still stand while 20th century buildings often require major renovation after a few decades suggests that maybe, just maybe, those old masons knew something about building for permanence. The human cost of creating these monuments was considerable. Every major medieval structure represents not just the master mason's vision, but the accumulated labour of hundreds or thousands of workers over decades of construction. It represents the masons who fell from scaffolding and died, the ones who were crippled by falling stone, the ones whose lungs slowly failed from stone dust exposure, the ones who spent their best years cutting stone under the sun and rain, leaving their youth in the walls and foundations of structures they'd never see completed. When you look at a Gothic cathedral or a medieval castle, you're looking at a monument to human capability, certainly, but also to human sacrifice and suffering. The legacy of medieval masonry continues in modern times through the structures that survived and through the traditions they established. Modern stonemasons restoring medieval buildings need to understand historical techniques to work sympathetically with original construction. Architectural historians study medieval structures to understand building methods and cultural priorities. Tourists visit cathedrals and castles, marveling at achievements that were created by people working with hand tools and extraordinary patience. What's particularly striking about medieval masonry is the contrast between the permanence of the work and the obscurity of the workers. We can visit Notre Dame or Westminster Abbey or countless other medieval structures and be awed by their beauty and scale. But we typically don't know the names of the masons who built them, the specifics of their lives, whether they took pride in their work or simply saw it as a job. The stones remain, solid and enduring, while the human beings who shaped them vanished into history, leaving only their magnificent work as evidence they existed at all. That anonymity probably didn't bother medieval masons as much as it might bother modern workers obsessed with personal recognition and individual achievement. Medieval society was more collective in outlook, with individual identity less emphasized than in modern cultures. Contributing to a structure that would serve the community for centuries might have been satisfying enough without needing your name carved in stone for posterity. Though some masons certainly did take pride in their work and wanted recognition, those masons' marks weren't purely functional, they also represented personal investment in quality and achievement. The seasonal nature of employment, the physical dangers, the health toll from stone dust, the need to travel for work, the periods of unemployment, all of these made masonry a challenging profession, despite the relatively good wages and the satisfaction of creating lasting structures. It required physical strength, technical knowledge, artistic capability, and organizational skills. It offered opportunities for social mobility through guild advancement and the chance to work on prestigious projects. And it left a legacy that literally shaped the medieval landscape and continues to define how we imagine the Middle Ages. Those weathered stone walls and soaring Gothic arches are more than just old buildings. They're evidence of human ambition, skill, and the desire to create something that transcends individual human lifespan and speaks across centuries. Medieval society's relationship with water was complicated. People needed it for drinking, transportation, powering mills, and providing food, but they also feared it, died in it regularly, and generally treated it with the wary respect that dangerous. Necessities commanded. This created a whole category of professions built around water, occupied by people who spent their working lives on rivers, lakes, and coastlines, extracting resources and providing services that kept medieval civilization functioning. These weren't glamorous jobs, and they came with risks that would make modern workplace safety regulations look like wishful thinking, but they were essential and provided livelihoods for substantial numbers of workers. Fishing was perhaps the most important water-based profession economically, not because fish was everyone's favourite food, but because Catholic religious practice made it a dietary requirement for a huge portion of the year. The Church prohibited meat consumption on Fridays during Lent, and on various other holy days and feast days that, when you added them all up, totaled somewhere around 150 days per year. That's nearly half the calendar when eating meat was considered sinful, and fish was the primary protein alternative. This wasn't a gentle suggestion. This was religious law enforced by the threat of eternal damnation, which was pretty effective motivation for compliance. This created consistent, reliable demand for fish that made fishing a viable profession, even though the actual work was difficult, dangerous, and often produced unpredictable results. A fisherman might go out and catch nothing, spending an entire day in cold, wet conditions and returning with empty nets. Or they might hit a school of fish and bring in more than they could easily process and sell before spoilage became an issue. The variability was part of the job, a calculated gamble where skill and knowledge improved your odds but couldn't eliminate the uncertainty. Not exactly the steady, predictable income that financial planners recommend. The types of fishing varied dramatically depending on whether you were working in freshwater or saltwater, in rivers, lakes, or oceans, and what kinds of fish were available in your region. River fishing might involve setting nets across sections of the river to catch fish swimming downstream, or using traps placed in strategic locations to capture fish during their seasonal migrations. Lake fishing could be done from shore with lines and nets, or from boats that allowed access to deeper water. Ocean fishing was the most dangerous and potentially most profitable, ranging from fishing close to shore to venturing out into open water, where storms could kill you and your crew without much warning. The equipment was relatively simple but required maintenance and occasional replacement that represented real capital investment. Nets had to be woven from thread or cord, a time-consuming process that was often done by women in fishing families during times when the nets weren't actively being used. Damaged nets needed constant repair. A tear could let your catch escape, turning a good fishing day into a waste of time. Hooks, lines, traps, and various other specialized gear all needed to be maintained, repaired, or replaced regularly. Boats, for those fishermen who used them, required even more maintenance and represented substantial investment that could be lost in a single storm or accident. The knowledge required to be a successful fisherman was considerable and largely unwritten, passed down through families and communities over generations. You needed to understand fish behavior, where different species would be at different times of year, what conditions made fish more active or more likely to be in certain locations, what bait or techniques worked best for particular species. You needed to read weather patterns, recognizing signs that a storm was coming, and you should head for shore rather than continuing to fish. You needed to know the geography of your fishing grounds intimately, where the deep channels were, where rocks or other hazards lurked beneath the surface, which areas were most productive. Seasonal variations dramatically affected fishing success and thus fishermen's income. Spring often brought spawning runs where fish migrated in predictable patterns, offering opportunities for large catches if you knew where and when to intercept them. Summer provided generally good fishing conditions when weather was favourable and fish were active. Autumn brought different species and different behaviours. Winter could make fishing impossible, or at least much more difficult and dangerous, especially in northern regions where ice might form or storms made going out on the water suicidal. The annual cycle of abundance and scarcity shaped fishing families' lives and required careful management of resources to survive the lean periods. The physical demands of fishing were substantial. Hauling nets full of fish required upper body strength and endurance. Rowing boats for hours to reach fishing grounds and return with your catch built impressive cardiovascular fitness. Standing in cold water, often in the early morning or late evening when fish were most active, exposed fishermen to conditions that contributed to various health problems. The repetitive motions of casting nets, pulling lines, or working traps created wear and tear on joints and muscles. Many career fishermen developed chronic joint problems, back pain, and general physical deterioration that came from decades of hard labour in wet, cold conditions. The cold and wet were particularly miserable. Modern people who occasionally get caught in the rain can't really appreciate what it meant to spend your entire working life exposed to water and weather without adequate protective clothing. Medieval fishermen didn't have waterproof rain gear, insulated boots, or quick-drying fabrics. They had wool and leather that became heavy and uncomfortable when wet, and they just endured the discomfort because there wasn't a better option. The constant exposure to cold water contributed to arthritis, rheumatism, and general susceptibility to illness that shortened many fishermen's working lives and often their actual lives. The danger of drowning was ever present and killed a significant percentage of fishermen over the course of a working lifetime. Most fishermen couldn't swim, which sounds counterintuitive until you realize that swimming wasn't a common skill in medieval Europe, and being able to swim wouldn't necessarily save you if you fell into cold water while wearing heavy clothing, or if you were knocked unconscious. Boats capsized in storms, people slipped and fell into rivers, nets or lines could tangle around limbs and pull people under. The lucky ones drowned quickly. The unlucky ones struggled, suffered, and drowned slowly. Either way, bodies often weren't recovered, leaving families without closure and sometimes without proof of death that might be needed for inheritance or widows' benefits. The social status of fishermen was relatively low despite the importance of their work. This was partly because the job was viewed as unskilled labour, even though it actually required considerable knowledge and experience. Partly because fishermen were poor. Even successful ones rarely accumulated significant wealth given the variability of catches and the costs of equipment and maintenance. partly because they smelled like fish, which is not a scent that enhances social appeal no matter how you look at it. They occupied a position similar to other food producers, necessary, underappreciated, and taken for granted by the people who benefited from their labour. The economics of fishing involved multiple participants beyond just the fishermen themselves. In many areas, fishing rights were controlled by lords, monasteries, or towns that charged fees for access to particular waters. Fishermen might need to pay for the right to fish in a specific river section or lake, either through a flat fee or a share of their catch. Markets required vendors to sell the catch, and these vendors might be the fishermen themselves or intermediaries who bought fish wholesale and sold retail. Transportation from fishing grounds to markets needed to be arranged and paid for. All of these factors meant that the price consumers paid for fish was much higher than what fishermen actually received for their catch. The preservation of fish was crucial because fresh fish spoiled quickly, especially in warm weather. Fishermen and fish vendors needed to move their product fast, ideally catching fish in the morning and selling them by afternoon before quality deteriorated noticeably. For catches that exceeded immediate market demand, preservation methods included salting, smoking, drying, or pickling in various brines. These preserved fish products could be transported longer distances and stored for extended periods, but they tasted different from fresh fish and sold for different prices. The salted herring that became a staple of medieval diet wasn't anyone's idea of a delicacy, but it was protein that wouldn't spoil and could be eaten months after it was caught. The religious calendar's impact on fish markets created interesting economic dynamics. As fasting days approached, fish prices would rise due to increased demand. During Lent, the 40-day period before Easter when meat was prohibited, fish consumption spiked and prices could become quite high. Wealthy people could afford fresh fish, and perhaps even luxury species, while poor people made do with the cheapest preserved fish they could obtain. This price volatility benefited fishermen and fish merchants when demand was high, but could hurt them when religious requirements weren't creating artificial scarcity of alternatives. Monasteries were major consumers of fish, given that religious communities observed strict fasting rules and often had the resources to maintain fish ponds or purchase fish regularly. Some monasteries developed sophisticated aquaculture systems with ponds stocked with carp, pike, or other species that could be harvested as needed. This monastic fish farming represented an early form of controlled food production that supplemented wild-caught fish and provided reliable supply for communities that needed fish year-round. The monks who managed these ponds needed to understand fish husbandry, feeding, disease management, breeding, harvesting, which was specialized knowledge in its own right. Now let's shift to the people who kept medieval transportation networks functioning when rivers and waterways had to be crossed, but bridges were rare and expensive. Ferrymen and boatmen. Rivers and streams were everywhere in medieval Europe, and they represented significant obstacles to travel and trade. You couldn't just wade across most rivers safely, especially when carrying goods or travelling with animals. Swimming wasn't an option for most people and wouldn't work for cargo anyway. Bridges existed but were limited to major crossings or wealthy areas that could afford the substantial investment required to build and maintain them. So for the vast majority of water crossings you needed a ferry. Ferry operations range from simple affairs with a single person rowing a small boat back and forth across a narrow river to more complex operations with large ferries capable of carrying horses, carts, and multiple passengers across wide rivers or even coastal waters. The simplest ferries were essentially rowboats or small rafts where the ferryman would pole or row passengers across. More sophisticated ferries used cables or chains stretched across the river, with the ferry attached to the cable and using the current to help propel it across. The largest ferries were flat-bottom boats that could accommodate substantial cargo and required multiple crew members to operate. The business model was straightforward: charge a fee for transporting people and goods across the water. Pricing varied based on distance, cargo weight, time of day, weather conditions, and whatever the market would bear. Ferrymen often operated under licenses granted by local authorities or landowners who controlled the crossing rights. These licenses gave the ferryman a monopoly on that particular crossing, but also required them to maintain service, follow rate regulations, and possibly pay fees or a share of revenue to the license holder. It was similar to the mill monopoly system, guaranteed business in exchange for restrictions and obligations. The work was physically demanding and required genuine skill. Rowing a heavy ferry loaded with passengers and cargo across a fast-moving river wasn't simple transportation. It was a task requiring strength, timing, and knowledge of the river's currents and hazards. Ferrymen needed to read the water, understanding where currents were strong, where eddies might throw off their trajectory, where shallow areas or submerged obstacles lurked. They needed to adjust their approach based on water levels that varied with seasons and rainfall. A crossing route that worked when water was low might be impossible when the river was in flood. The danger level varied considerably depending on the specific crossing and conditions. Ferrying across a calm, narrow river on a sunny day was relatively safe. Crossing a wide, swift river during spring floods or in the middle of winter with ice flows was genuinely dangerous and could easily result in drowning for everyone aboard if something went wrong. Ferrymen died in accidents with disturbing regularity. Boats capsized, people fell overboard, equipment failures sent ferries careening downstream into rocks or other hazards. Passengers died too, which created liability issues and occasionally legal problems for ferrymen whose negligence or poor judgment contributed to deaths. The social interactions inherent in ferry operations were interesting. Ferrymen encountered a cross-section of medieval society: nobles, clergy, merchants, peasants, soldiers, pilgrims, criminals fleeing justice, all of them needing to cross the river and thus needing the ferryman's services. This gave ferrymen access to news, gossip, and information that flowed through their area. They heard about political developments, economic conditions, local scandals, and everything else people discussed while travelling. A ferryman who was observant and remembered what they heard could become surprisingly well informed about regional affairs. The opportunity for theft or other crimes was present and sometimes exploited. An unscrupulous ferryman could rob passengers in the middle of the river where they were vulnerable and had no escape. Drowning could be claimed as an accident when it was actually murder and robbery. Stories of evil ferrymen who killed and robbed travellers were common enough in medieval literature to suggest this was a recognised danger, though probably most ferrymen were honest operators who wouldn't risk execution for whatever small amount. Travellers were carrying. The possibility was there, though, and travellers crossing with strangers probably felt some anxiety about it. The regularity of service varied depending on how busy a particular crossing was and how the ferry was operated. Major crossings might have continuous service during daylight hours with ferries running back and forth as passengers and cargo arrived. Minor crossings might require passengers to call for the ferryman, who would come from their house or another activity to perform the crossing. Night crossings were often unavailable or cost substantially more given the increased danger and inconvenience to the ferryman. In areas with tidal waters, ferry schedules had to account for tides. Some crossings were only possible at certain stages of the tide when water depth and current were suitable. The relationship between ferrymen and their communities was economically important but socially complex. Everyone needed ferry services occasionally, making the ferryman necessary and giving them a certain amount of local importance. But the ferry monopoly and the inability to simply go elsewhere if you didn't like the service or prices created resentment similar to what Millers experienced. Ferrymen were in a position to exploit travellers, charging high prices, providing poor service, being rude or demanding, and people had limited recourse unless they wanted to risk drowning trying to cross without the ferry. Bridge construction gradually reduced the need for ferries at major crossings, which was economically threatening to ferrymen who lost their livelihood when a bridge made their service obsolete. Some ferrymen fought against bridge construction proposals, recognizing that a bridge meant unemployment for them and anyone who worked with them. Others perhaps welcomed the change, given that ferry operation was hard, dangerous work with inconsistent income. The replacement of ferries by bridges was a slow process that played out over centuries, with some ferry crossings remaining in operation into the modern era, because building a bridge was never economically justified. The skills required for ferry operation weren't necessarily transferable to other work, which meant ferrymen who lost their routes due to bridge construction or changing river courses might have difficulty finding alternative employment. They understood boats and rivers, but might not have other marketable skills that could support them in different work. This vulnerability to economic displacement was shared by many medieval workers whose specialized knowledge was valuable only within a narrow context. The family involvement in both fishing and ferry operations was common. Children helped with fishing from young ages, learning the skills and knowledge that would let them eventually work independently. Wives and daughters mended nets, processed fish, sold catches at market, and generally contributed to the household's fishing enterprise. Sons often followed fathers into the profession, inheriting boats, equipment, and the knowledge needed to succeed. Ferry operations might be run by families with different members taking shifts or helping to load and unload cargo. This family-based economic structure was typical of medieval working-class occupations where survival required everyone's contribution. The physical toll of these water-based professions accumulated over years of exposure to cold, wet conditions and hard labour. Fishermen and ferrymen often developed chronic pain, respiratory problems from breathing cold, damp air, and general debilitation that forced early retirement or reduced their capability to work effectively. Few could afford to stop working entirely even when their bodies were breaking down, so they continued as long as possible, probably in considerable discomfort. The idea of a comfortable retirement was fantasy. You worked until you physically couldn't anymore, then relied on family or community charity to survive your final years. The weather dependency of water trades created feast or famine economics that required careful management to survive. Good weather meant good fishing and steady ferry business, bringing income that needed to be saved for the inevitable bad periods. Storms shut down fishing and often made ferry crossings too dangerous to attempt, meaning no income until conditions improved. Winter brought months of reduced activity or complete idleness in northern regions, where ice made water work impossible. A family that spent everything they earned during productive months would starve during unproductive ones. So prudent financial management was necessary for survival, despite generally low incomes and constant temptation to spend money on immediate needs or wants. The relationship with nature that water-based workers developed was intimate and often fatalistic. You understood that the water could kill you, that storms could destroy your livelihood, that the fish might simply not appear despite your best efforts. But you also depended on that same water for your income and survival. This created a relationship characterized by respect, wariness, and acceptance of forces beyond human control. Medieval people generally had less illusion about controlling nature than modern people do. They lived closer to natural cycles and were more aware of their vulnerability. The religious aspects of fishing went beyond just the market created by fasting requirements. Fishermen and sailors often had particular devotion to saints associated with water and navigation. St. Nicholas was popular among seafarers. Various local saints were invoked for protection. The danger inherent in water work made people more likely to seek supernatural protection, and the unpredictability of catches encouraged prayers and offerings in hopes of divine assistance. Whether this actually improved fishing success is doubtful, but it probably provided psychological comfort and a sense that someone was looking out for you even when you were alone on the water. The environmental knowledge that fishermen accumulated was substantial but rarely recorded. They understood fish populations, seasonal patterns, habitat requirements, and ecological relationships in their local waters through direct observation and experience. This practical knowledge about aquatic ecosystems was sophisticated even if it lacked the theoretical framework that modern ecology provides. A good fisherman could predict where fish would be based on water temperature, current, season, and various other factors, demonstrating an intuitive understanding of fish behavior that was genuinely impressive. The guild structures for fishing and ferrying varied by location. Some areas had fishing guilds that regulated who could fish where, set quality standards for fish sold, and generally protected members' interests. Ferry operations might be licensed individually rather than organised collectively, though ferrymen probably knew each other and shared information informally. The guild presence was less developed for these professions than for some urban crafts, partly because the work was dispersed across numerous locations rather than concentrated in cities, and partly because the workers were generally poorer and less politically organised. The market relationships for fish were complex and often exploitative. Fishermen who needed to sell their catch quickly had limited bargaining power against fish merchants who could wait them out, knowing the fish would spoil and the fishermen would have to accept whatever price was offered or get nothing. Some fishermen tried to bypass middlemen by selling directly to consumers, but this required time and access to markets that not everyone had. The fish trade became increasingly commercialized over the medieval period, with sophisticated distribution networks moving fish from coastal areas to inland markets and preserved fish being traded internationally. The coastal fishing communities developed distinctive cultures shaped by their relationship with the sea and their economic dependence on fishing. These were tight-knit communities where everyone knew everyone, families intermarried, and traditional knowledge was carefully preserved and passed down. The isolation of many fishing villages, accessible mainly by sea and often built in locations chosen for fishing access, rather than agricultural potential, meant they maintained practices and attitudes that might differ from inland communities. The danger and hardship of fishing created solidarity and mutual support systems that helped people survive when disaster struck. What united all these water-based professions, fishermen, ferrymen, boatmen, was their relationship with an element that was simultaneously essential and dangerous. Water provided food, transportation, and power, but it also killed people regularly and destroyed livelihoods unpredictably. The workers who made their living from water accepted these risks because they had to, because the work was available and paid something, because it was what their families had always done. They weren't romantic figures having adventures on the water. They were practical people trying to survive in occupations that offered opportunity, but demanded constant vigilance and carried genuine danger. The legacy of medieval water trades persists in modern fishing and water transportation industries, though technology has transformed the work dramatically. Modern fishing boats with engines, sonar, and refrigeration bear little resemblance to medieval fishing vessels, yet the fundamental challenge of extracting food from the water remains. Ferries still operate in many locations, though they're now powered by engines rather than oars and currents. The basic economic model of charging for transportation across water gaps that bridges don't span continues. What's been lost is the immediate danger, the constant exposure to elements, and the acceptance of high mortality rates that characterized these professions in the Middle Ages. The ordinary fishermen and ferrymen whose names are lost to history played essential roles in feeding medieval populations and keeping trade and travel networks functioning. Every Friday fish meal that kept someone out of sin required fishermen who risked drowning to catch it. Every merchant who crossed a river with trade goods depended on ferrymen who risked capsizing to transport them. These workers were the infrastructure that made medieval life possible, providing services so essential that they were simply taken for granted by most people who benefited from them. Their reward was a hard living, early death from accident or illness, and complete obscurity in historical records that focus on nobles, clergy, and major events while ignoring the ordinary people who actually made everything work. That obscurity doesn't diminish their importance or the difficulty of their work. It just reflects medieval society's priorities and the nature of historical record-keeping that preserved information about the powerful while overlooking the workers who kept civilization functioning. When we think about medieval life, we should remember that it wasn't just knights and castles and cathedrals. It was also people spending cold mornings pulling nets from rivers, rowing ferries back and forth across the same stretch of water, day after day. Day, dealing with the practical challenges of extracting a living from a world that didn't make it easy. Those people deserve recognition even if we'll never know their individual names or stories. Medieval cities required a whole category of workers whose job was essentially to make urban life possible. People who maintained order, communicated information, and performed the unpleasant tasks that kept society functioning. These weren't glamorous positions, and some came with serious social stigma that made them pariahs despite their necessity. But cities couldn't operate without them, which created interesting contradictions where people simultaneously depended on these workers and looked down on them. Let's examine 3 professions that perfectly illustrate this tension between necessity and disrespect. Town criers, also called heralds or bellmen in various contexts, served as the primary mass communication system in medieval cities. This might not sound particularly impressive to modern people who can access instant global communication through devices in their pockets, but in a society where most people couldn't read and printing hadn't been invented yet, you needed some way to disseminate information to the urban population. The solution was simple if not subtle. Have someone walk through the streets shouting news, announcements, and official proclamations loud enough that everyone within earshot could hear them. The qualifications for this job were straightforward but not universal. You needed a loud voice, the kind of carrying voice that could project across a crowded marketplace or down a narrow street and still be understood. You needed good lungs and the stamina to spend hours walking and shouting without your voice giving out. You needed excellent memory because you'd be repeating the same announcements multiple times as you moved through different areas of the city, and you couldn't exactly check your notes while you were shouting. And you needed to be understood by the local population, which meant speaking their language or dialect clearly, and without the kind of accent that would make comprehension difficult. The content of what town criers announced varied from the mundane to the critically important. New laws or ordinances from city authorities needed to be communicated to residents who couldn't read the written proclamations posted in public spaces. Market regulations, tax deadlines, changes in weights and measures standards, all of this administrative information had to reach the population somehow. Public health warnings during plague outbreaks or other health crises needed to be disseminated quickly. Lost children or property could be announced in hopes someone had information. Upcoming executions or other public spectacles were advertised to ensure good attendance, because apparently watching someone die was considered entertainment worth promoting. The actual job of being a town crier was more complex than just walking around yelling. You typically started by ringing a bell to get people's attention, because medieval streets were noisy places and you needed some way to signal that an announcement was coming. Then you'd deliver your message, usually following a standard formula that began with something like "Oyez, oyez, oyez," which is Norman French for "hear ye, hear ye, hear ye," and was basically the medieval equivalent of "listen up, people." The message itself needed to be delivered clearly and repeated as necessary to ensure understanding. Then you'd move to the next location and do it all again. The walking routes were carefully planned to cover the entire city or assigned district efficiently, while ensuring everyone had opportunity to hear the announcements. A town crier might spend an entire day making rounds, hitting major gathering points like markets, church squares, taverns, and residential neighborhoods. The physical demands were real, hours of walking over cobblestone streets that were uneven, often muddy or icy depending on season, and navigating through crowds of people, carts, animals, and general urban chaos. Your voice had to hold up through repeated shouting in all weather conditions, which probably led to chronic hoarseness and throat problems for career criers. The social status was ambiguous in interesting ways. Town criers were official representatives of city authority, which gave them a certain status and protection. Interfering with a crier performing official duties could result in punishment because you were essentially obstructing government communication. People needed to pay attention to announcements because they might contain information relevant to their lives or livelihoods. But the crier himself was still just a guy shouting in the street, someone of relatively low social standing who happened to have a loud voice and city employment, not exactly commanding respect through personal prestige. The reliability of the information town criers disseminated was only as good as the sources providing it. Criers announced what they were told to announce by city authorities or paying clients, without necessarily having any way to verify accuracy. This made them conduits for propaganda, rumour, and occasionally complete nonsense alongside genuine news. A savvy urban resident probably learned to evaluate announcements critically, rather than accepting everything shouted by the town crier as gospel truth. Though in practice, most people probably just listened and hoped the information was accurate because what else could they do? The employment structure varied. Some town criers were full-time city employees with regular salaries, while others worked on commission, being paid by whoever wanted announcements made. The commission-based model created potential conflicts, where a crier might prioritize announcements from better-paying clients over official business, or where wealthy individuals could flood the information space with their announcements while poorer people couldn't afford to have messages cried. The full-time employment model avoided these issues but meant the city had to budget for communication costs, even when there wasn't much to announce. The job security was reasonable given that communication needs were ongoing, but it wasn't exactly a growth profession with advancement opportunities. You started as a town crier and ended as a town crier, probably with a worn-out voice and tired legs. There weren't a lot of other occupations that valued the specific skills you'd developed. Being able to shout loudly wasn't particularly transferable, outside of maybe auctioneering or street vending. So people tended to stay in the role until they physically couldn't continue, at which point they'd need to find something else or rely on charity. Now let's shift to night watchmen, who served as medieval cities' combination fire department, police force, and general security presence during the dangerous hours after dark. Medieval cities at night were genuinely hazardous places. No street lighting beyond occasional torches or lanterns meant streets were pitch black. Crime rates increased because criminals could operate under cover of darkness. Fire risk was constant given that buildings were packed closely together, mostly made of wood, and heated and lit by open flames. Someone needed to patrol and watch for problems, hence watchmen. The basic job was to walk designated routes through city districts throughout the night, watching for fires, suspicious activity, crimes in progress, or other problems requiring response. They typically carried lanterns to light their way, staffs or clubs for self-defense and apprehending criminals, and often bells or horns to raise alarms. The work required staying awake and alert during hours when human bodies naturally want to sleep, maintaining vigilance in cold, dark, sometimes dangerous conditions, and being ready to respond to emergencies without backup or support immediately. Available. The fire watch function was particularly important because urban fires could be catastrophic. Medieval cities were tinderboxes waiting for ignition, wooden buildings with thatched or wooden shingle roofs packed so close together that fire could jump from building to building easily, creating conflagrations that might destroy entire neighborhoods or even cities. Early detection was crucial to prevent small fires from becoming major disasters. Watchmen who spotted smoke or flames would raise the alarm, wake sleeping residents, and try to organize firefighting efforts before the blaze spread out of control. Given that firefighting technology consisted mostly of bucket brigades and hoping for the best, prevention through vigilance was really the main defense. The crime prevention aspect of the job was more problematic. Watchmen were supposed to deter criminals through their presence and apprehend those they caught committing crimes. In practice, this meant confronting dangerous people in dark alleys while outnumbered and outarmed, which was not a particularly safe position to be in. Smart watchmen probably avoided confrontations they couldn't win and focused more on being visible enough to discourage casual crime rather than actively pursuing hardened criminals. The pay wasn't good enough to justify getting stabbed in a dark street over someone stealing from a shop. This brings us to the suspicion that watchmen were often corrupt or incompetent or both. The complaints about watchmen being in league with criminals, ignoring crimes for bribes, or simply failing to do their jobs properly were common enough that they probably had some basis in reality. The structural conditions encouraged corruption, low pay, dangerous work, employment of people who couldn't find better jobs, limited supervision or accountability, and plenty of opportunities to take bribes or look the other way. A watchman who encountered someone committing a crime had choices: confront them and risk violence, report them and maybe receive a small official reward if anything came of it, or accept a bribe to forget what you saw and go about your patrol. The third option was safer and more profitable than the first two. The quality of men willing to work as night watchmen was apparently not always impressive, if contemporary complaints are to be believed. This was not a profession that attracted the best and brightest. It was what you did if you couldn't get better work: old men past their prime for physical labour, men with drinking problems, men who'd failed at other occupations. The pay was low, the hours were terrible, the work was boring and uncomfortable, punctuated by moments of genuine danger. Cities struggled to find capable men willing to do the job for what they were willing to pay. The result was often watchmen who were more interested in staying warm and avoiding trouble than in actively maintaining security. The enforcement powers watchmen had were limited and ambiguous. They could certainly raise alarms and summon help. Whether they could actually arrest people, use force, enter private property, or take other law enforcement actions depended on local regulations and circumstances. In practice, they probably did what they thought they could get away with varying levels of legality and legitimacy. The lack of clear authority and oversight created situations where watchmen might abuse what power they had, harassing people they didn't like or failing to act when action was needed, because they weren't sure they had authority to intervene. The organizational structure for watch forces varied by city size and governance. Larger cities might have relatively organized watch systems with multiple shifts, designated districts, supervisors overseeing watchmen, and established procedures. Smaller towns might have a handful of men who were supposed to patrol, but probably spent a lot of time sitting in taverns unless something actually required their attention. Some cities used volunteer systems where citizens were required to serve periodic watch duty as part of their civic obligations, which meant you had completely untrained, unpaid, unwilling watchmen doing a poor job because they had no choice but to be there. The social status was predictably low. Watchmen were necessary but not respected. They were poor men doing difficult, dangerous work for inadequate pay, often suspected of corruption or incompetence. The comparison to modern police isn't quite accurate because watchmen had less authority, training and institutional support than modern law enforcement. But the basic dynamic of being simultaneously essential and mistrusted probably feels familiar. Nobody particularly liked or trusted watchmen, but everyone was glad they existed because the alternative, no night security at all, was worse. The actual dangers watchmen faced were real and sometimes fatal. Confronting armed criminals could result in serious injury or death. Fires killed watchmen who got too close or were trapped by spreading flames. Winter cold could cause frostbite or hypothermia during long night patrols. Buildings collapsing, getting attacked by dogs or other animals, falling into open sewers or construction sites in the dark. The list of hazards was extensive. For the low pay and poor working conditions, watchmen were taking genuine risks that probably weren't adequately compensated. Now we come to perhaps the most stigmatized profession in medieval society, the executioner. Every functioning legal system needs someone to carry out death sentences, and medieval justice systems relied heavily on capital punishment for serious crimes. But actually killing people as your job, even when it was legally sanctioned and socially necessary, marked you as someone outside normal society. The contradiction was stark. Executioners performed a function everyone agreed was essential. They were paid relatively well for their services, and yet they were treated as pariahs who decent people avoided associating with. The actual work involved more than just executions, though that was certainly the most dramatic and best-paid aspect. Executioners often also administered other corporal punishments: floggings, brandings, mutilations, various tortures if the legal system employed judicial torture. They might be responsible for maintaining the gallows, pillory, and other punishment equipment. They might serve as torturers extracting confessions, a role that was legally distinct from executioner in some places but often performed by the same person. Some executioners had the right to certain perquisites like the clothing of executed criminals or the ropes used for hanging, which could be sold as relics or charms. The methods of execution varied by time period, location, and the condemned person's social status. Hanging was common for ordinary criminals, though the technique wasn't the drop-and-quick death method that later became standard. Medieval hanging often meant slow strangulation, as the person was hauled up or pushed off a ladder. Beheading was typically reserved for nobility, being considered a more honourable death. Burning at the stake was used for heresy and certain other crimes, creating a spectacularly horrible public death. Drowning, breaking on the wheel, and various other methods existed in different jurisdictions. The executioner needed to be competent with whichever methods were legally employed in their area. The skill required was considerable, particularly for beheadings. A competent executioner could sever a head with a single stroke, causing rapid death and minimizing suffering. An incompetent executioner might require multiple blows, hacking rather than cleanly cutting, creating a drawn-out horror show that was traumatic for everyone involved, including presumably the person being executed. This created an interesting dynamic where condemned prisoners might actually want a skilled executioner, and their families might even tip the executioner to ensure a quick, clean death. Yes, tipping the man about to kill you or your loved one to ensure he did a good job. Just one of those medieval ironies that defies modern sensibilities. The social isolation executioners experienced was extreme and institutionalized through various regulations and customs. In many cities, executioners were required to live outside city walls or in specific marginalized neighborhoods. They might be prohibited from certain public spaces or required to wear distinctive clothing that marked them as executioners. Marriages between executioner families and ordinary citizens were often prohibited or at least strongly discouraged. Children of executioners faced discrimination and limited opportunities. The profession tended to run in families because few people outside the profession would associate with executioners enough to marry into them, and the social stigma meant it was difficult to leave the profession for normal work. The paradox was that executioners were performing a legally mandated public service that everyone agreed was necessary for justice. They weren't acting on their own initiative. They were carrying out sentences imposed by courts and authorities. Yet the taboo against killing and the visceral horror of death made people transfer their discomfort onto the person wielding the axe or tightening the noose. The executioner became the embodiment of death and violence, someone who dealt in killing as their daily work, and that marked them as fundamentally different and disturbing regardless of the legal and moral justifications for what they did. The pay was actually quite good relative to other working-class occupations, which was necessary to get anyone to do the job given the social costs. Executioners might receive a salary from city authorities, plus per-execution fees. The fees could be substantial, especially for high-profile executions. The various perquisites and side incomes from selling ropes, clothing, or offering to heal ailments with the executioner's touch, which was believed to have special properties, could add up to significant additional income. A busy executioner in a large city could actually accumulate real wealth, though they couldn't enjoy it in normal society. The psychological toll of the work is something we can only speculate about, since executioners didn't exactly leave detailed journals about their feelings. Killing people regularly, even criminals you'd never met and had no personal grudge against, probably affected you in ways that weren't healthy. Some executioners apparently became hardened and indifferent, viewing it as just a job they performed competently. Others reportedly drank heavily, perhaps trying to numb themselves to what they did. The social isolation meant they couldn't discuss their work or their feelings about it with anyone except family members who were similarly isolated. Whatever psychological support systems or counselling modern people take for granted simply didn't exist. The hereditary nature of the profession created dynasties of executioners who passed the role down through generations. Sons learned the trade from fathers, inheriting not just the techniques but the social position and all its complications. Some executioner families developed reputations for skill and professionalism that could extend across multiple cities as family members took positions in different locations. The family connections also provided the only real social network executioners had, since they were excluded from normal community relationships. The relationship between executioners and the legal system was complex. Authorities needed executioners to function but didn't want to be too closely associated with them. The executioner was a necessary evil, someone who did the dirty work that maintained order but whose presence was uncomfortable. This created situations where executioners had official positions and responsibilities but were still treated as outsiders and polluted individuals. They were inside the system as functionaries but outside society as pariahs. The public spectacle aspect of executions made executioners paradoxically both visible and invisible. Everyone watched executions, which were major public events that drew crowds. The executioner was the centre of attention during these spectacles, the person all eyes were on as they performed their grim duty. Yet afterward, the same people who watched avidly would avoid the executioner on the street, refusing to acknowledge or associate with them. The executioner could be the star of the show and a social outcast simultaneously, which must have been a surreal experience. The equipment executioners used was specialised and often personalised. Executioners' swords or axes were distinctive tools of the trade, kept sharp and maintained carefully because dull blades made executions messier and more difficult. The gallows and other execution equipment needed maintenance to function properly. Some executioners had almost ritualistic relationships with their tools, viewing them as extensions of their professional identity. The equipment itself took on sinister associations. An executioner's axe was an object of horror and fascination, something people might want to see but definitely didn't want used on them. The legitimacy that came from performing legal executions didn't fully protect executioners from accusations and suspicions about other activities. Because they dealt in death professionally and had access to corpses and body parts that were believed to have magical properties, executioners were sometimes accused of necromancy, witchcraft, or other dark practices. The fact that they lived on society's margins and operated in morally complex spaces made them targets for rumours and accusations that they were doing more than just executing criminals. Some of these suspicions probably had basis in reality. Executioners might well have sold body parts or other materials to people seeking charms or medicines, creating a side business that reinforced their sinister reputation. What's striking about all three of these professions, town criers, watchmen, and executioners, is how they illustrate the gap between necessity and respect in medieval society. All three performed functions that cities needed to operate. All three involved real work, often difficult or dangerous work, that required showing up and doing the job regardless of personal preference. And all three occupied low social status despite their importance, either because the work itself wasn't prestigious or because it involved distasteful aspects that society preferred not to think about too much. The town crier was necessary for communication, but was just a guy shouting in the street. The watchman was necessary for security, but was probably corrupt or incompetent, or at least suspected of being so. The executioner was necessary for justice, but was treated as a contaminated outcast despite performing legally mandated duties. This pattern of essential but stigmatized work appears repeatedly in medieval society and tells us something important about how that society understood labor, status, and social worth. The fact that these positions were usually filled by people who lacked better options highlights the economic desperation that drove much of medieval labor market dynamics. Town crying wasn't anyone's dream job. It was what you did if you had a loud voice and needed work. Night watch wasn't a career path people aspired to. It was night shift security work that someone had to do and that paid barely enough to survive on. Being an executioner might pay well, but the social costs were so high that only people born into executioner families or those who truly had no alternatives would take the position. Modern people who complain about their jobs might reflect that at least they probably don't face social ostracism for how they earn their living. The urban service workers who kept medieval cities functioning, not just these three professions but dozens of others, rarely receive recognition in histories focused on nobles, battles, and political developments. Yet their work was essential infrastructure. Cities needed information distributed, security maintained, and justice administered. Without the ordinary workers who performed these tasks, urban life would have been impossible. They deserve recognition as the unsexy but necessary workforce that made medieval urban civilization possible, even if their contemporaries didn't particularly appreciate them, and history has largely forgotten them. The legacy of these professions continues in modified forms. Modern cities still need information disseminated, though we use electronic media rather than guys shouting in the street. Security is still essential, though we have professional police forces rather than poorly paid night watchmen. Justice systems still require people to carry out sentences, though executioners are now state employees operating in prisons rather than public performers at gallows. The basic functions remain necessary even as the methods and social contexts have changed dramatically. That continuity of need across centuries suggests these weren't just medieval peculiarities, but rather responses to fundamental urban governance challenges that persist in different forms even now. Understanding these ordinary professions helps demystify medieval cities and remind us that behind all the romantic imagery of medieval urban life, the markets, the guilds, the impressive architecture, there were ordinary people doing unglamorous jobs that made everything else possible. The next time you encounter a medieval city in a movie or book or game, remember that someone needed to announce laws to the illiterate population, someone needed to patrol dangerous streets at night, and someone needed to execute condemned criminals. Despite the social costs of doing so, those someones were real people trying to make a living in a world that needed their work but didn't particularly respect them for doing it. We've spent considerable time discussing various medieval professions, but there's been a significant omission in this coverage that needs addressing before we wrap up. Women. They've appeared occasionally in our discussions, wives helping with fishing, daughters mending nets, female spinners supplying thread to weavers. But this scattered presence doesn't adequately represent the reality of women's role in the medieval economy. Women weren't just helpers or occasional participants in economic life. They were absolutely essential workers whose labour kept families and entire industries functioning, even though historical records often ignored them and their contributions. Rarely received official recognition. The invisibility of women's work in medieval records creates challenges for understanding their actual economic participation. Official guild records, tax documents, legal proceedings, and other sources that historians rely on often simply don't mention women's work or mention it only in passing. This doesn't mean women weren't working, it means their work wasn't being recorded in ways that survived for historians to study. The result is that for centuries historians underestimated or overlooked women's economic contributions, creating a distorted picture of medieval labour that focused almost exclusively on male workers in prestigious trades, while missing the reality of how medieval economies actually functioned. Let's start with textile production, which we discussed earlier but which deserves revisiting with explicit focus on women's central role. Spinning thread from raw wool or flax was almost entirely women's work, performed in homes across medieval Europe by women of all social classes. This wasn't occasional hobby craft. This was essential industrial production that supplied the raw material for the entire textile industry. Every piece of cloth that weavers created started with thread that women had spun, probably working in the spaces between other household tasks, turning raw fibre into the product that male weavers would then use at their looms. The economics of spinning were structured in ways that disadvantaged women while enriching others. Spinning was typically piecework paid at very low rates because there were so many women doing it that labour supply far exceeded demand. A woman might spend hours spinning thread and receive payment that was a tiny fraction of what a weaver would earn for turning that thread into cloth, despite the fact that her work was equally essential to the final product. The low pay reflected not the unimportance of the work, but rather the devaluation of women's labour and the limited economic alternatives women had for earning income. The term spinster that eventually came to mean unmarried woman originated from this work. Spinning was so universally associated with women's work that spinster literally just meant woman who spins, which included basically all women. The evolution of the term to mean specifically unmarried women reflected the reality that spinning provided one of the few ways unmarried women could support themselves, however meagerly. An unmarried woman without family support might spend her days spinning thread for whatever pittance she could earn, an economic precariousness that probably contributed to the term's eventual negative connotations. Women also dominated other stages of textile production that required less skill or capital than the prestige trades controlled by male guilds. Carding and combing wool to prepare it for spinning was women's work. Washing and fulling cloth after weaving was often done by women, though male fullers controlled the commercial fulling operations. Women dyed cloth, worked in finishing processes, and generally filled in all the gaps in textile production that men's guilds didn't claim as their exclusive territory. The textile industry simply couldn't have functioned without this female labour, but women's participation rarely translated into the kind of economic power or social status that male guild masters enjoyed. Brewing was another trade where women played central roles that are often overlooked in discussions focused on male-dominated guilds and commercial operations. Small-scale brewing for household consumption and local sale was predominantly women's work throughout much of the medieval period. The alewife was a common figure in medieval towns, a woman who brewed beer or ale in her home and sold it to neighbours, operating what amounted to a small informal business. This provided income for families while also serving a social function, as women's homes became gathering places where people came to purchase drink and probably stayed to socialise. The brewing process required knowledge and skill that was passed down from mothers to daughters. You needed to understand how to malt grain, how to control fermentation, how to achieve desired flavours and strengths, how to recognise when something had gone wrong and the batch was spoiled. Women who brewed commercially developed reputations based on the quality of their products, and successful brewsters could actually make decent money from sales. The fact that much of this brewing was informal and didn't involve guild membership doesn't mean it wasn't economically significant. It was providing income for families and serving substantial portions of urban populations with their daily beer. Consumption. The gradual commercialization and professionalization of brewing over the medieval period pushed women out of the trade in many areas. As brewing shifted from household production to larger commercial operations controlled by male guilds, women found themselves excluded from what had been their trade. The reasons were economic. Men wanted control of a profitable business, but were often justified through claims about women's moral unsuitability for the trade or their inability to meet quality standards, despite centuries of women successfully brewing perfectly good beer. This pattern of women being pushed out as trades became more lucrative and formalized appears repeatedly in medieval economic history. Market trading was another area where women participated extensively, despite often being marginalized in historical accounts. Women sold produce in markets, vended fish, traded eggs and dairy products, and generally engaged in retail commerce at a small scale. Some of this was selling products from their own households or from family agricultural production. Some was buying goods wholesale and selling retail, operating as intermediaries in distribution networks. The market woman with her basket of goods was a common sight in medieval cities, important enough that they appear in art and literature, yet their economic role was often dismissed as trivial domestic activity rather than recognized as the commercial work it actually was. The capital requirements for market trading were low enough that women could participate without needing access to substantial resources. You could buy a basket of eggs from a farmer and sell them in town at a markup, using just the small amount of working capital needed for the initial purchase. This accessibility made market trading one of the few commercial activities available to poor women who needed to earn money. The profits were modest, the work was hard, standing in markets all day in all weather, but it provided income that contributed to household survival. Midwifery was exclusively women's work, and not by choice but by social convention, and sometimes explicit prohibition on male participation in childbirth. Every birth required a midwife's assistance, making this essential medical care that affected virtually every family. Midwives gained knowledge through apprenticeship with experienced practitioners, learning to recognize normal versus problematic labor, how to assist with difficult births, how to care for newborns, and how to handle complications. The best midwives developed reputations that extended across communities and could command good fees from wealthy clients, though they were also expected to serve poor women who couldn't pay or could pay only minimally. The medical knowledge midwives possessed was substantial and practical, gained through direct experience with hundreds or thousands of births over a career. They understood anatomy and physiology related to pregnancy and birth, recognized danger signs, new techniques for managing various complications, and accumulated case experience that informed their practice. This was genuine medical expertise that in some ways exceeded what male physicians understood about childbirth, since physicians rarely attended births and mostly theorized from medical texts rather than hands-on practice. Yet midwives were considered mere craftswomen rather than learned medical practitioners, their knowledge devalued because it was experiential rather than textual, and because it was held by women rather than men. The risks midwives faced were considerable. Births sometimes went badly despite competent care, and midwives might be blamed for outcomes beyond their control. Accusations of witchcraft sometimes targeted midwives, particularly when unusual circumstances surrounded births, or when midwives possessed herbal knowledge used for various purposes. The intimate access midwives had to births, their knowledge of women's bodies, and their role in matters of life and death made them simultaneously essential and potentially suspect figures in their communities. Most practiced their craft without incident, but the possibility of accusations created an undercurrent of danger that other medical practitioners didn't face to the same degree. Women worked in countless other occupations beyond these examples. They kept inns and taverns, worked in food preparation, served as domestic servants, laboured in agriculture, engaged in various crafts, and generally participated across the full spectrum of medieval economic life. The pattern was that women's work was often informal, lower paid, and less likely to be recorded in official sources, creating an illusion of limited female economic participation that doesn't match the reality of how much women actually contributed to household and community economies. The situation for widows deserves particular attention because widowhood created unusual opportunities for women to engage in commercial activities that married women couldn't easily pursue. When a craftsman or merchant died, his widow might inherit his business and continue operating it, sometimes for years or even the rest of her life. Guild regulations varied on this. Some allowed widows to continue their late husband's businesses and even employ workers, while others pushed widows out quickly by requiring they remarry a guild member or sell the business. Where widows were allowed to continue operating, they proved perfectly capable of running complex commercial enterprises, which shouldn't have been surprising but apparently was to many male guild members who tried to restrict widows' economic independence. Widows running businesses occupied an interesting social and economic position. They were women, which put them below men in social hierarchy and limited their legal rights and social autonomy. But they were also business owners and employers, which gave them economic power and required them to make decisions and engage with markets and authorities. They had to manage workers, negotiate with suppliers, maintain quality standards, and generally do all the things male business owners did. Their success demonstrated that women were perfectly capable of complex commercial activity when given the opportunity, though this lesson seemed to require constant relearning by societies that preferred to believe women were unsuited for business. The experience of widows managing businesses also highlights how much wives contributed to their husbands' businesses during their marriages, even when that contribution wasn't formally recognized. A wife who'd worked alongside her husband for decades, helping with production, managing accounts, dealing with customers, and generally being involved in all aspects of the business, accumulated knowledge and skills that made her capable of running things independently when widowhood gave her the legal authority to do so. The idea that she suddenly gained these capabilities upon her husband's death was absurd. She'd been contributing all along, but only widowhood made her contribution visible and official. The restrictions on women's economic participation weren't based on actual inability or incompetence. They were based on social beliefs about women's proper roles and male guilds' desire to limit competition and maintain control of lucrative trades. Where women were allowed to participate, they demonstrated competence equal to men in the same fields. Where they were excluded, it was through regulations and social pressure rather than any natural unsuitability. This makes the historical marginalization of women's work even more frustrating. It was artificial restriction that limited economic efficiency and opportunity based on gender rather than ability. Now let's turn to the question of social mobility through ordinary professions, because one of the interesting aspects of medieval society is that it wasn't quite as rigidly stratified as sometimes portrayed. Yes, there was a strong tendency toward hereditary occupations and limited movement between social classes, but there were also mechanisms for talented or lucky individuals to improve their circumstances through skilled work, and their children might advance even further through education or strategic marriages. The ordinary professions we've discussed offered pathways for this mobility, though success required skill, hard work, favourable circumstances, and usually a considerable amount of luck. The apprenticeship system was a primary mechanism for social mobility, allowing boys from relatively modest backgrounds to learn valuable trades that could support comfortable middle-class lives. An apprentice who completed training and became a journeyman had marketable skills that would employ them steadily. A journeyman who saved money, built a reputation, and eventually achieved master status could operate their own business and potentially become prosperous. The guild system created structured paths for advancement that were theoretically meritocratic, based on demonstrated skill rather than just inherited status, though in practice family connections and wealth certainly helped. Successful craftsmen could accumulate real wealth through their work, particularly if they operated in prestigious trades or served wealthy clientele. A master armourer producing high-quality goods for nobles, a master mason working on major cathedral projects, a successful merchant dealing in valuable commodities, these were people who might own property, employ numerous workers, and live in comfort that many would envy. Their children would grow up in circumstances far more favourable than their fathers had, with opportunities for education and advancement that the previous generation lacked. Education was a major path for upward mobility, and successful craftsmen often invested in educating their sons beyond just teaching them the family trade. A craftsman's son who learned to read and write Latin, studied with clerics or at emerging universities, might enter church service, become a notary or legal professional, or take up some other learned occupation that had higher social status than manual trades. This represented real advancement up the social ladder, moving from working class to professional class in a single generation through a combination of parental sacrifice and individual talent. The economic prosperity that successful craftsmen achieved could also be leveraged through strategic marriages. A wealthy craftsman's daughter with a substantial dowry became an attractive marriage prospect for minor nobility or professional families looking to secure financial resources. A craftsman's son with good income prospects might marry into a merchant family, creating connections that enhanced business opportunities. These marriages weren't typically love matches, they were economic alliances that benefited both families, but they facilitated social mobility by connecting working-class wealth with higher status families. The mobility wasn't unlimited or easy, and most people remained in similar economic circumstances to their parents. But the possibility existed, and the pathways were visible enough that people could aspire to advancement for themselves or their children. A shepherd's son might become a successful wool merchant. A blacksmith's son might become a master craftsman employing multiple workers. A craftsman's son might gain education and enter church service. These trajectories required talent, hard work, fortunate circumstances, and help from others, but they happened with sufficient frequency that they represented real possibilities rather than fairy tale fantasies. The towns and cities offered more opportunities for mobility than rural areas where social structures were more rigid and economic opportunities more limited. Urban economies, with their diversity of trades, their commercial dynamism, and their relatively fluid social structures, created space for advancement that agricultural villages couldn't match. This was one reason why people moved to cities despite the disease, crime, and overcrowding. The opportunities, however difficult to seize, were better than what rural life offered for many people. What's particularly important about these ordinary professions as paths for mobility is that they operated outside the traditional feudal hierarchy. You didn't need to be granted a title by a king or inherit an estate to improve your circumstances. You needed to learn a valuable skill, work hard at it, build a reputation, and capitalize on opportunities when they appeared. The guild system and craft economy created parallel structures for status and prosperity that weren't based on noble birth or church position, but on demonstrated competence in practical trades. The social fabric of medieval society was woven from these everyday occupations in ways that the focus on nobles and clergy obscures. The shepherd tending flocks, The miller grinding grain, the weaver at their loom, the baker preparing bread, the blacksmith at the forge, the mason building walls, the fisherman casting nets, the town crier announcing news, the widow running her late. Husband's business, these were the people who kept civilization functioning. Their work fed cities, clothed populations, built infrastructure, maintained order, and produced the goods and services that everyone from peasants to kings depended on. Each profession was a thread in the complex tapestry of medieval economic and social life. Some threads were thick and prominent: the wealthy merchant, the master craftsman with large workshops, the successful professionals. Some were thin and barely visible: the struggling widow selling eggs in the market, the old shepherd dying alone on a mountainside, the journeyman who never achieved master status. But each thread was necessary to the overall pattern, and removing any significant category of workers would have caused the entire structure to collapse. The skill and knowledge these workers possessed deserves recognition even across the gulf of centuries. The shepherd who could predict weather by reading the sky and animal behaviour. The miller who understood complex mechanical systems and could maintain equipment that was constantly breaking. The weaver who created fine cloth through hours of precise work. The apothecary who compounded medicines from dozens of ingredients. The stonemason who understood practical geometry well enough to design stable arches. The midwife who managed childbirth complications with limited tools and no anesthesia. These were genuinely skilled professionals with expertise that took years to develop, and that was essential to their communities. The physical toll that many of these occupations extracted was the price paid for keeping medieval civilization running. The stonemason breathing stone dust until their lungs failed, the shepherd freezing in mountain winters, the blacksmith deafened by years of hammering metal, the fisherman drowning in cold water, the barber surgeon infected by diseases from patients they treated, the night watchman beaten by criminals in dark alleys. The bodies that were broken by labour, the lives cut short by occupational hazards, the suffering that was considered just part of the job. This was the human cost of the medieval economy, paid disproportionately by ordinary workers who had limited power to refuse or improve their conditions. The contradictions within medieval society show clearly in how these professions were treated. Work that was essential was often poorly paid. Workers who were necessary were frequently disrespected. Women who were critical to economic functioning were marginalised and their contributions dismissed. The complexity and difficulty of many occupations was underappreciated by people who benefited from them. The gap between economic value and social status, between necessity and compensation, between contribution and recognition, these contradictions characterised much of medieval working life. Yet despite the hardships, the low pay, the dangers, and the lack of recognition, people continued doing these jobs generation after generation. They trained their children in the trades, passed down accumulated knowledge, maintained standards of quality and competence, and took pride in work well done even when others didn't appreciate it. The human capacity to find meaning and satisfaction in work, to take professional pride even in difficult circumstances, to care about doing things properly even when nobody's watching, all of this shows in medieval workers' approach to their occupations. The legacy of these medieval workers continues in obvious and subtle ways. The structures they built still stand in cities across Europe, drawing tourists who admire what medieval masons created. The economic structures and business practices they developed evolved into modern systems. The guilds they formed were precursors to modern professional organizations and labor unions. The technologies they refined laid foundations for later industrial development. The social tensions between workers and employers, between labor and capital, that characterized medieval work life persist in different forms today. Understanding these ordinary medieval professions helps demystify the Middle Ages and reveals the human reality behind the romantic imagery. Yes, there were castles and cathedrals and knights, but there were also shepherds shivering on mountainsides, millers suspected of cheating customers, weavers going blind from close work, fishermen drowning in cold rivers, and executioners living as social outcasts despite performing legally necessary duties. The real medieval world was complex, contradictory, often harsh, and built through the labour of ordinary people whose names we'll never know, but whose work made everything else possible. As we close this exploration of medieval professions, it's worth reflecting on how much we take for granted in modern life: the availability of goods and services, the safety standards that protect workers, the social mobility that's theoretically accessible, the recognition that work deserves fair compensation regardless of who performs it. These weren't givens in the medieval world. They were gradually fought for and developed over centuries, built on the experiences and struggles of workers whose circumstances we've examined tonight. The medieval workers who spent their days at looms, forges, mills, fishing boats and building sites, who cut stone until their lungs failed, who brewed beer in their homes, who spun thread for pittance, who midwifed births at all hours, who rang bells announcing news, who patrolled dark streets. These people were not quaint historical curiosities. They were human beings trying to survive and perhaps prosper in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. Their lives had meaning and value beyond just their economic function. They loved, hoped, suffered, took pride in their work, worried about their children, and experienced the full range of human emotion and experience that we do. So when you think about the Middle Ages, remember the ordinary people. The woman spinning thread by candlelight, the man hammering metal in his forge, the widow trying to keep her late husband's business running, the fisherman casting nets at dawn, the stonemason high on scaffolding, the baker preparing bread before sunrise, the midwife hurrying to a birth, the shepherd alone with his flock on a distant mountainside. These were the people who built medieval civilization, thread by thread, stone by stone, loaf by loaf, birth by birth. Their work created the world they lived in, and their legacy extends to our own time in ways we often fail to recognize. The tapestry of medieval society was complex, with every profession a thread woven into the larger pattern. Some threads were gold, representing wealth and prestige. Many were simple wool, representing ordinary work and modest lives. Some were dark, representing suffering and exploitation, but all were necessary to the whole, and pulling any significant thread would have caused the entire fabric to unravel. That interdependence, that connection between all the different types of work and workers that made society function, is perhaps the most important lesson from examining these ordinary medieval professions. We've walked together through the medieval workplace tonight, meeting the people whose labour built and sustained civilization while remaining largely invisible in history books focused on kings and battles. From the fields to the workshops, from the streets to the rivers, from the heights of scaffolding to the depths of winter poverty, these workers lived and laboured and created the world around them. Their story is the story of the Middle Ages, more fundamentally than political events or military campaigns, because their work was the foundation everything else rested on. I hope this journey through medieval work life has given you new appreciation for the complexity and humanity of the period, and new respect for the ordinary people whose extraordinary efforts made medieval civilization possible. Their names are forgotten, their individual stories lost, but their collective legacy remains in the structures they built, the traditions they established, and the economic and social systems they developed that continue influencing us today. So now, as we reach the end of this exploration, I want to thank you for spending this time learning about these remarkable ordinary people. Whether you're listening in New York or London, Tokyo or Sydney, Mexico City or Mumbai, wherever you are in the world right now, I hope you've enjoyed this glimpse into the lives of medieval workers. May these stories of shepherds and millers, bakers and blacksmiths, fishermen and scribes stay with you and enrich your understanding of the past. And with that, I'll wish you all a very good night. May your dreams be peaceful, your sleep restful, and when you wake, may you face your own work, whatever it may be, with something of the same determination and skill that medieval workers brought to theirs. Sweet dreams, everyone.